Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. Whether you're winding down after a long day, seeking comfort in a quiet moment, or simply letting your mind drift, this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, let the weight of the day gently melt away. Picture yourself in a place where you feel completely at peace. Maybe it's a warm, candlelit room with soft blankets wrapped around you, or perhaps it's a serene meadow under a canopy of stars. Wherever your mind takes you, just allow yourself to settle there, completely at ease. Sometimes, I wonder where you might be listening from. Maybe a cozy corner of your home, a quiet car ride, or even a faraway place I can only imagine. If you feel like sharing, I'd love to know. Just drop a little note in the comments. And if you find the space comforting, it's always lovely to know you'd like to come back. You can tap that button to join me again whenever you need a calm escape. Tonight, I have a story for you, a gentle, soothing tale to lull you into a deep and peaceful sleep. So find your favorite spot, let yourself sink in, and let the story take you where it will. I never thought my life would lead me here, standing in front of a weathered old house on the edge of a quiet town, clutching a lease agreement like it was some sort of lifeline. The peeling paint on the shutters and the sagging porch weren't exactly inviting, but the rent was dirt cheap, and I couldn't afford to be picky. After the divorce, I was left with a battered sense of self, a dwindling bank account, and the urgent need to start over. This house, as unsettling as it looked, was my chance at a clean slate, or so I hoped. The first thing that struck me was the smell. It wasn't overpowering, just strange. A faint mustiness, like damp wood and something metallic lingering in the air. The real estate agent, a chipper woman named Donna, assured me it was just the age of the place. These older homes always have a bit of character, she'd said with a practiced smile, glossing over the warped floorboards and the faint, persistent creak that followed our every step. Moving day was uneventful. A couple of boxes, a second-hand couch, and a bed frame I'd wrestled out of my old apartment, all crammed into the back of a rented van. By dusk, I'd unpacked just enough to make the place livable. The house was eerily quiet as I set up my little lamp on the bedside table. Outside, the wind howled faintly, rattling the old windows. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at the edges of my mind. The first few nights were uneventful. I told myself I'd been overthinking everything, that the house was just old and creaky. But there were little things, subtle quirks, that I couldn't ignore. The faint smell of burnt wood in the hallway, even though there wasn't a fireplace. A cold draft that seemed to slip through the house no matter how many windows I checked. And then there was the floorboard just outside my bedroom door, the one that creaked loudly at random times, even when I was alone. By the end of the week, I'd settled into a routine. I woke early, made coffee in the tiny kitchen, and headed to my new job at the bookstore downtown. Evenings were spent unpacking or reading on the worn-out couch, with the occasional glass of wine to take the edge off my nerves. My neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, was the first person to welcome me. She was a sweet, elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, and her cookies were almost enough to make me forget the strange vibe of the place. Almost. You know, Mrs. Callahan said one afternoon as we stood on my porch, this house has a bit of a reputation. She leaned in, lowering her voice like she was sharing some juicy gossip. People say it's cursed, some nonsense about the original owner dabbling in dark things. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. Dark things, rituals, the occult, that sort of thing, she said, her voice dropping even further. The poor man went mad, or so the story goes. Strange things have happened here ever since. My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile. I'm sure it's just old rumors. Every town has its ghost stories. Right. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read, then patted my arm. Just be careful, dear. Sometimes, rumors have a way of being true. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying her words in my head. The house groaned and creaked around me, and I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, just the settling of the old beams. But then, just past midnight, I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy and uneven, moving down the hallway outside my bedroom. I held my breath, straining to listen. My heart pounded in my chest as the sound stopped, just outside my door. The creak of the floorboard echoed in the silence. I lay perfectly still, clutching the blanket like it could somehow shield me from whatever was standing outside my door. The silence pressed down on me, thick and oppressive, as I waited for something, anything, to happen. My rational mind tried to explain it away. It's just the house settling, I told myself, or maybe the wind shifting the floorboards. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, fumbling in the darkness. My hands trembled as I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the door. The light revealed nothing but the same chipped paint and tarnished doorknob I'd seen a dozen times before. But the sound of the creaking floorboard lingered in my ears, like a faint echo. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke the next morning, the sun was streaming through the thin curtains, painting the room in a warm, golden glow. Everything felt normal, like the events of the night before had been a dream. But as I made my way to the kitchen for coffee, I noticed something strange. The hallway runner, a cheap rug I'd picked up at a thrift store, was bunched up in front of my bedroom door, like someone had dragged their feet across it. My stomach tightened as I smoothed it out, trying to ignore the way my hands trembled. I shook it off, forcing myself to focus on the mundane tasks of the day. Work at the bookstore was uneventful, and by the time I got home, I was exhausted enough to almost forget about the night before. Almost. That evening, I decided to take a closer look at the house. I'd been so preoccupied with unpacking and adjusting to my new life that I hadn't really explored it. The house wasn't big, just a small, two-story structure with a basement I hadn't dared to venture into yet. The upstairs was unremarkable. My bedroom, a tiny guest room I used for storage, and a bathroom with old, clawfoot tub that always seemed to have a faint rust-colored stain at the bottom, no matter how many times I scrubbed it. The main floor was equally uninspiring. There I did notice a faint discoloration on one of the walls in the living room, a circular stain, almost like something had been hung there for years and left its mark. But it was the basement that unsettled me the most. The door was tucked away in the kitchen, almost hidden behind the pantry shelves. The old brass knob was cold to the touch, and the door creaked loudly as I opened it. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, and the faint smell of damp earth wafted up to meet me. I hesitated, my flashlight cutting through the shadows as I slowly made my way down. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the bottom, I was shivering. The basement was small and cluttered with debris, old furniture, rusted tools, and boxes of who knew what. But it was the far corner that caught my attention. A small, wooden table sat there, covered in a thick layer of dust. On it was a strange assortment of objects, melted candles, a rusted dagger, and what looked like a dried-up bundle of herbs tied with a piece of red string. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. There was a book lying on the table, its leather cover cracked and brittle with age. When I opened it, the pages were filled with strange symbols and handwriting so spidery and uneven that it was hard to read. One phrase, however, stood out. Asterisk, the door must never be opened. Asterisk. A chill ran down my spine, and I slammed the book shut. I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone, like someone, or something, was watching me. The air grew colder, and I swear I heard a faint whisper, so quiet it could have been the wind. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me and locking it for good measure. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone as I called Mrs. Callahan. She answered on the second ring. "Oh, dear, is everything all right?" I hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. "Mrs. Callahan, what do you know about the man who used to live here?" "The original owner." There was a long pause. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. His name was Edgar Harland. He lived there over a century ago. People said he was strange, obsessed with unnatural things. They say he wanted to open a door to the other side. The other side of what? I whispered. The afterlife, she said simply. Or something worse. My blood ran cold. What happened to him? No one knows for sure, she said. Some say he vanished. Others say he went mad and, well, let's just say there were rumors. Dark rumors. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself it was just a story, an old tale meant to scare people. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, just past midnight, the footsteps started again. The footsteps had started again. They echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing just outside my door. I lay in bed, heart hammering in my chest, eyes wide open in the dark. The floorboards creaked under the weight of the unseen figure, each step sounding heavier than the last. I tried to convince myself it was just a house. Houses settled, right? Old wood creaked. It was nothing to be afraid of, but something in me knew better. The same dread that gripped me when I first moved and was creeping up again, crawling under my skin, whispering that this was different. I held my breath, waiting for the footsteps to pass, but they didn't. They lingered just outside my door. I shot up in bed, my mind racing. What if it was someone in the house? What if I wasn't alone? I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But before I could press the buttons, the footsteps stopped. And then, just as I thought I might have imagined it all, I heard a soft knock on the door. One knock, quiet, but unmistakable. My stomach twisted, and I froze, unable to move. It was too late for anyone to be visiting. No one knew I was living here. Not yet. No one except Mrs. Callahan, and she wouldn't knock at this hour. I waited for another sound, but there was nothing. No second knock, no footsteps retreating. Just silence. A silence so thick it felt suffocating. The air in the room grew cold. So cold that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. A chill that seemed to crawl across the bed, seeping into my bones. I could feel it, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. Something watching, waiting. I jumped out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor with a slap. I didn't care about the strange noises anymore. I didn't care if it was just an old house settling or some figment of my overactive imagination. I needed answers. I had to know what was happening here, what was living here. With shaky hands, I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and made my way into the hallway. My breath quickened as I moved down the stairs, past the old wooden railing that had grown slick with years of dust. Each step felt like a heavy weight, like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't escape. The basement door loomed at the end of the hallway. It was almost mocking in its stillness, as if it knew I would be back. I hadn't dared to go down there since I found that strange altar in that cursed book, but now I had no choice. I opened the door slowly, the old brass knob squealing in protest. The air hit me immediately, a gust of cold, damp air that sent a shiver down my spine. The basement was darker than I remembered, the flashlight's beam cutting through the blackness in thin, weak slices. The corner where the table had stood was empty. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the room, the light trembling in my hand. The table, the book, the odd collection of objects, they were all gone. It was as if they had never existed. Panic surged through me. Had I imagined it all? But no. The smell was still there, faint but unmistakable, like wet earth in decay. And there, on the floor, was a piece of red string. I reached down to pick it up, feeling an unsettling sense of déjà vu wash over me. The string was tied in a loose knot, the ends fraying as if it had been disturbed recently. My fingers brushed against it, and I felt a cold tingle run through my body. I spun around, the flashlight beam flickering wildly. A low sound filled the room, A whisper so soft I could barely hear it, but unmistakably there. It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It sounded like the wind, but with a strange, guttural undertone, like something trying to speak but trapped. The air grew thick, heavy, and the temperature dropped even further. I could see the frost forming on the walls, crawling up the old stone like it was alive. I backed up, my breath shallow, my heart racing. I had to get out of here. I turned toward the stairs, but before I could take a step, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, the force of it shaking the walls. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror. The room seemed to be shrinking, the shadows closing in on me. The whispering grew louder, and then, just as I was about to scream, there was a sudden, deafening silence. Then I heard it, a voice, clear as day. Asterisk leave dot asterisk. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the door, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran up the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. The door slammed behind me, and I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. But the moment I calmed myself, I realized something horrifying. I wasn't alone in the house anymore. There was something there. I could feel it, a presence that lingered just behind me, watching, waiting. I turned around slowly, but there was nothing, just a quiet, empty hallway. But the feeling remained, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't shake it. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the silence, and once again, the footsteps started. But this time, they didn't stop. The footsteps never stopped. They were constant, a rhythmic sound that echoed through the walls, up the stairs, and across the floors like a heartbeat that wouldn't cease. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest, hoping against hope that I was just imagining it. But no, I wasn't imagining it. The sound of heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, came closer and closer to my door, just like the night before. I wanted to scream, to get out of the bed and run, but my body was frozen, paralyzed with fear. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, my fingers gripping it so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The cold was unbearable now, a biting chill that seemed to seep into my bones, no matter how much I wrapped myself up. I wanted to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just a house settling, that it was just an old building with strange noises. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, and for a long moment, there was nothing, not even the faintest sound of breathing or movement, just a suffocating silence that stretched out before me, as if the entire house was holding its breath. I waited. Nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to face whatever this was. I threw the covers off and stood up, my feet cold against the wooden floor. My body trembled, but I forced myself to walk toward the door, each step echoing in the quiet of the room. When I reached it, I hesitated for just a moment before I slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I peered into the hallway. Nothing. I stepped out, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The hallway was empty, just as it had been every other night. The house was dark, silent, and completely still. But there was something wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I saw it, a faint shadow, barely visible against the far wall, but unmistakable. It was moving. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the shadow shift. It was slow, deliberate, like it was testing the air, waiting for something. I stepped forward, barely making a sound as I moved closer. The closer I got, the more the shadow seemed to grow, stretching across the wall like it was alive, like it was reaching out for me. And then it vanished. Just like that. I blinked, my mind racing, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no way I'd imagined it. The shadow had been there, and it was moving. Something was in this house with me. I rushed back into my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I didn't dare turn off the light this time. I couldn't. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and anxiety. The footsteps didn't return. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just outside my door, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. I needed to figure out what was going on. I spent the day researching the house, digging into any records or stories I could find. It didn't take long to uncover the dark history of this place. Edgar Harland had been obsessed with the occult, with opening doors to the unknown, to realms beyond our understanding. The locals said he had delved too deep, that he had found something in the house, something he wasn't supposed to find. They said he tried to open a door to the afterlife, but instead, he invited something else in. I shuddered as I read the details. The house had been abandoned after Harland's disappearance, but people still spoke of it in hushed tones. Strange occurrences had been reported by those who had lived here, each one more terrifying than the last. The most chilling part? No one had ever left the house willingly. I ran my fingers over the pages, my mind racing. There had to be something in this house, something connected to Harland, something that had been waiting for years to be discovered. That evening, I decided to do what I had been avoiding, go down to the basement again. I had to know. I had to find out if the whispers were real, if there was truly something down there waiting. The basement door creaked open as I descended the stairs, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps, each step feeling heavier than the last. I reached the bottom and froze. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped drastically. I felt like I was walking through a fog of cold, like the house itself was alive, breathing with me. And then, there it was. The altar. The table I had seen before. It was back, just as I remembered it. But this time, the objects were different. There were more candles, melted and dripping with dark wax. The dried herbs were replaced with something else, something I couldn't identify. I stepped closer, my heart in my throat, and that's when I saw it. A journal. The pages were old, brittle, and yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, my fingers brushing against the pages as I scanned the words. The handwriting was familiar, Harland's, but it was a final entry that stopped me cold. Asterisk, the door is almost open. I can feel it. It calls to me. Tomorrow, I will unlock it, and they will come to Asterisk. A cold wave of fear washed over me, and I slammed the book shut. The whispering started then, louder than before, and the air grew even colder. I could feel it. Whatever was in this house, it was Asterisk here, Asterisk, and it was waiting for me. I didn't think. I ran, bolting up the stairs and slamming the basement door behind me. But as I stood there, breathless and terrified, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me upstairs, something that hadn't been there before. I couldn't stay here anymore, but I knew that no matter where I went, whatever was in this house wouldn't let me leave. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The sounds, the whispers, the overwhelming cold. It was too much. I spent the hours pacing around my room, checking the locks, staring at the door, and waiting for something to happen. It was nearing dawn when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, creeping closer and closer. This time, I didn't hesitate. I couldn't. I grabbed the flashlight and shoved my feet into shoes, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but one truth stood out among them all. Whatever was in this house, it was not just some trick of the old wood or the wind. It was real. The footsteps had stopped just outside my door again. I froze, my hand still gripping the flashlight. There was something different this time, though. Something darker, more suffocating. The air in the room felt heavier, as though it was being pushed down upon me by some unseen force. And then the door creaked. I couldn't move. The door opened slowly, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness. No one was there, but the air was thick, so thick I could barely breathe. It felt as though 100 eyes were on me, watching, waiting. I stepped into the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to know. I had to confront whatever was behind this. The house was silent again, almost too silent. The usual creaks and groans were gone, replaced by a stillness that made my skin crawl. I walked slowly down the hallway, flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadows seemed to stretch out before me, growing darker with every step I took. At the end of the hallway, I saw it, an old door, partially ajar, leading down into the cellar. I had never seen it open before. It was always locked, but tonight it was different. I walked toward it, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. When I reached the door, it swung open with a low groan. A cold wind rushed up from the stairs, carrying the smell of damp earth and decay. It felt as though the air had been waiting for me. I descended into the basement once again, my heart in my throat. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, and the closer I got to the bottom, the colder it became. I shivered uncontrollably, but I pressed on. At the foot of the stairs, I noticed something strange. The altar was gone. The table, the candles, the symbols, they were all gone, replaced by a large, blackened circle in the center of the floor. It looked as though something had been burned into the ground, an intricate pattern of lines and shapes that twisted and turned in on themselves. My flashlight flickered as I moved closer, casting eerie shadows across the floor. The pattern seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it was somehow a live star. I bent down, my fingers brushing against the charred edges of the circle. That's when I saw it. Something had been written on the floor. The words were carved into the wood, not with a tool, but with something far sharper, far more sinister. The letters were old, almost faded, but I could make them out. Asterisk, they are waiting for you. Asterisk. I recoiled, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, but it couldn't keep up with the flood of fear crashing over me. They? Who were they? Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. The cold was unbearable, biting into my skin, and I could feel my breath fogging up in front of me. My flashlight flickered again, and then everything went black. I stood there, frozen in the darkness, listening to the sounds of my own shallow breathing. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the flashlight. I pressed the button again, and a weak beam of light cut through the blackness. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood at the far end of the basement, just outside the reach of the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, and shrouded in darkness. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, and it was Esther's waiting star. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. Then it stepped forward. The moment it did, I felt a pressure in my chest, as though the air itself was being sucked out of the room. My vision blurred, and I staggered back, my hands reaching out for support. I needed to get out of there. I turned and bolted for the stairs, the sound of heavy footsteps following me, echoing through the basement. Each step I took felt like it was pulling me further into the dark, into something I couldn't escape. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut behind me, my body trembling uncontrollably. But even as I pressed my back against the door, I could feel it, the presence, still out there, still waiting. I ran up the stairs to my bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it. But the house wasn't quiet anymore. The whispers had returned, louder this time, more frantic. They seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding me. I couldn't tell if they were inside my head or if they were real, but the fear in them was unmistakable. I couldn't stay here any longer. I gathered what little I could, throwing clothes and essentials into a bag, but I couldn't stop shaking. My hands fumbled as I tried to pack, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. I had to leave. I had to leave before it was too late. But as I turned to leave the room, I heard it again, the footsteps coming closer, getting louder. The thing was coming for me, and I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. The footsteps were right outside my door now, heavy and deliberate, like someone, something was pacing, waiting for me. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in tighter with every passing second. I knew what I had to do, but my body refused to obey. I stood frozen, staring at the door, my heart thudding so loudly I was sure it could be heard all the way down the street. It was as though the house had become a living, breathing thing, and it was hungry. I snapped out of my trance and moved to the window, my heart racing. But the blinds were drawn, and the thought of opening them seemed even worse than staying in the dark. If I looked outside, would I see it standing there, waiting in the shadows? Or worse, would it asterisk see me asterisk? I tried the door again, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was locked. Asterisk I asterisk had locked it, and yet it felt as if something was holding it shut from the other side, making sure I couldn't escape. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else entirely, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I moved toward the closet, pulling the door open with trembling hands. The coats, the boxes, everything was still there, but I wasn't looking for them. I was looking for the journal, the one that had been left behind by the previous tenant, the one that might hold answers, or curses. I wasn't sure anymore. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I stepped over to the old dresser. I pulled open the top drawer, rummaging through old receipts and miscellaneous papers, but there was nothing. Not the journal. I tried another drawer, then another, each one holding nothing but more mundane junk. But as I went to close the last drawer, I felt something shift under the very bottom of it. Something asterisk different star. I reached down, my fingers brushing against the edges of a small, leather-bound book. My heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the journal I had been looking for. I pulled it out quickly, flipping it open to the first page. The writing was cramped, messy, and nearly illegible in some spots. But there was something asterisk strangely familiar asterisk about it. Something that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. The first entry was dated several years ago, and the handwriting was frantic, almost like the person was desperate. Asterisk, it's happening again. I can feel them in the walls. They won't stop. The rituals don't work anymore. I need to get out, but I can't leave the house. It's too strong. It won't let me leave. Asterisk. My breath caught in my throat. What was this? A curse? A warning? I flipped the page, my hands trembling, and read on. The entries grew more erratic as they went, detailing strange occurrences, footsteps in the walls, whispers at night, a cold that never went away. And then there was mention of something far darker. Asterisk, the door is opening again. I feel it. The thing that has been waiting. I tried to stop it, but it's too late now. I hear them. They're coming for me. They want to take me to the other side. I can't fight them anymore. I'm trapped. Asterisk. I slammed the book shut, my stomach turning in knots. This was no ordinary haunting. Whatever was in this house was ancient, something that had been awakened, something that had asterisk never left star. My pulse quickened as I began to piece together the truth. The previous tenant, the one who had babbled about curses and rituals, had been trying to stop whatever had been unleashed here, but they hadn't succeeded. In fact, they were consumed by it. The sound of footsteps was growing louder now, closer. It wasn't just in my head. I wasn't imagining it. It was real, and whatever had been waiting for me was now at my door. I had to go. I had to get out of this house before it was too late. I grabbed the journal, stuffing it into my bag. I bolted from the room, my eyes scanning every corner of the house as I moved toward the stairs. The footsteps were right behind me, like they were chasing me, dragging their heavy weight across the floor. I reached the stairs, but as I stepped onto the first one, I felt it, a cold hand on my ankle, something icy, something unnatural. I screamed and yanked my foot back, but it wasn't enough. It was pulling me down. I scrambled up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. But just as I reached the top, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. It had been locked, but now it was wide open, letting in the cold night air. And standing in the doorway, watching me, was a figure, tall, dark, and towering. It was Asteris's waiting star. The darkness around it seemed to swallow everything else, leaving only the glowing, empty space where its eyes should have been. The presence was suffocating, unbearable. I could feel the weight of its stare on me, and I knew Asteris, that it wasn't going to let me go. But I wasn't going to die here. With everything I had left, I ran. I ran through the house, out the front door, and into the night. I didn't stop until I was a mile away, the weight of the journal still burning a hole in my bag. My chest ached with every breath, but I didn't care. I didn't look back. But the moment I thought I was safe, I heard it, the footsteps, echoing through the darkness, coming after me, and no matter where I ran, it would never stop. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. And the one after that, well, that's when I realized something far worse than mere exhaustion was starting to take hold of me. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It wasn't just the feeling of being followed. There was something deeper, something far more insidious, creeping into my bones and wrapping itself around my mind like a vice. I could hear the house calling to me. No matter how far I went, how much I tried to run, the sound of the footsteps followed. Not literally. No, it wasn't like someone was physically chasing me anymore. But the sound was in my head, like a whisper I couldn't escape. And sometimes, when I least expected it, I'd hear it coming from the walls or the floor beneath me. It was soft at first, a distant echo that made me question if I was just imagining things. But then it grew, louder, more insistent. It had been days since I left that cursed house, but the house had never left me. It followed me in every creak of the floorboards, in every gust of wind that rattled the windows. It followed me in my dreams, too, and there was no escaping it. I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the doorway, tall, dark, and silent, waiting, watching. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but the feeling of it, the weight of its gaze, was so real that I felt it pressing on me wherever I went. I began to research the house. I had to know what I was dealing with. I needed answers. There was no peace, no respite. And the more I looked into the history of the place, the more I realized that I wasn't the first to suffer its curse. The town records were sparse. No one really talked about it. But the few people who did spoke of an old mansion, a place long abandoned, but still carrying with it a reputation of darkness. They said the house had once belonged to a man, an eccentric scholar who was obsessed with the occult. He'd been a recluse, keeping to himself for years, with no friends and no visitors. And then, one day, he disappeared. Some said he'd opened a door to another world. Others said he'd made a deal with something dark, something beyond our comprehension. But no one knew for sure. No one had ever dared to ask. I was about to give up. The darkness, the weight of the house's history, was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then, one evening, I received a letter. It was addressed to me, though I couldn't imagine who would know I had moved into the house. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the front in neat, yet familiar handwriting. I opened it carefully, the paper brittle in my hands. Inside was a single note, written in the same frantic, desperate scrawl I'd seen in the journal. It was short, but its message was unmistakable. Asterisk, you think you escaped, but you haven't. It's not over. You're still a part of it. The house never lets go. You'll see it again. It will come for you. Asterisk. I felt my stomach drop as I read those words over and over. Whoever had written it knew what was happening to me. They understood. The footsteps in the walls grew louder, more frequent. The whispers returned, snaking through my mind, filling every quiet moment. They were coming for me, and this time, I wasn't sure if I could outrun them. That night, I went back to the house. I had no plan, no hope of solving this, but I couldn't run forever. I had to face whatever it was that had latched onto me. I had to confront the thing in the dark that had been following me. The house was just as I remembered, old, dark, and suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. But it was familiar now, in a way. I could feel the house's pulse beneath my feet, the creaks of the old wood, the way the darkness pressed in on me from every direction. I walked slowly through the rooms, each one filled with an oppressive silence. But as I entered the living room, something was different. There was a scent, a faint smell of sulfur. I froze, my heart pounding. The air was suddenly thick with dread, and the temperature in the room dropped, sending a chill through my body. The walls seemed to close in on me, and for the first time, I truly felt like I was no longer alone. I turned, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the shadows, the smell, and the suffocating silence. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, a shadow, standing in the doorway. It wasn't human. I couldn't describe it. It was tall, but impossibly thin. Its shape was wrong, twisted, as though it was made of shadows that shifted and writhed. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were black voids, pulling me into them, threatening to swallow me whole. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then the footsteps started again. Not in the walls, not in the floor, but right behind me. I spun around, but the figure was gone. The room was empty. The footsteps, however, were still there, echoing through the house. They were right behind me. I ran. I bolted out of the room, down the hallway, through the door, but the footsteps followed. I could hear them growing closer, faster, and the air, felt colder than it ever had before, like 1,000 frozen hands were reaching out to grab me. But this time, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how I made it out of that house. My feet moved on their own, my mind a blur of panic and confusion. The footsteps behind me, were getting closer, not just in sound but in presence. I could feel it now, the weight of whatever it was that chased me, breathing down my neck, clawing at my heels, getting closer with every frantic step I took. I couldn't think. I couldn't stop. I just ran. The door, the one that had been wide open before, was now shut. I slammed into it, throwing all my weight against it, desperate to escape. It wouldn't budge star. My hands shook as I fumbled with the handle, but the lock was stuck. Panicking, I yanked harder, but nothing. The door wouldn't open. The footsteps were right behind me, now unmistakably close. My breath was ragged, and I could feel the cold creeping into my skin, the chill sinking into my bones, something icy, something not of this world, seeping into the very air around me. The house was suffocating, the walls closing in with each passing second. There was no escape, no way out. I turned and ran toward the back of the house, my legs shaking, my mind a jumbled mess of fear and dread. There was a back door. I remembered. If I could just get to it. The darkness pressed around me, a tangible force, as though it wanted to swallow me whole. I reached the back door, my hand trembling as I pulled at the knob, but once again, nothing star. It was locked. I turned, breathing heavily. I scanning the room for any way out, any way to escape this nightmare. But there was no way out, no way to run. I was trapped, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway. A shadow, tall and thin, completely still but radiating a presence so powerful, so evil, that it made my heart stutter in my chest. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The shape was wrong, too twisted, its limbs too long, its head too large. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark pits, endless voids that seemed to pull me toward them. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, strangled by the cold, thick air. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare at it, paralyzed, unable to look away. The footsteps behind me stopped. The figure didn't move. And then, a voice. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. More like a whisper, a pull in my mind. A asterisk command star. Asterisk, you cannot leave dot asterisk. I felt it. Asterisk felt asterisk it in my soul, in every fiber of my being. The words weren't just spoken. They were woven into the very air around me, penetrating my thoughts, invading my mind. The force of it was overwhelming. I wanted to run, to scream, to escape, but I couldn't. I couldn't. The thing, it was controlling me. I could feel it, a pressure against my chest, my throat. It wanted to drag me back into the house, to keep me here forever, just like it had with everyone else who had come before me. I had to get out. But how? I turned away, trying to think, trying to focus, but the figure was still there, looming, an ever-present weight pressing down on me. Then I remembered something. The journal. The pages had been clear about one thing. Escape was possible, but it came at a price. It mentioned something about breaking the curse, but I hadn't understood it fully. The only way out was to face the thing in the dark. I looked around, frantic, but there was no time. The footsteps, asterisk they asterisk, were back, growing louder, faster. The house was alive now. It was breathing. It was moving. The floor beneath my feet cracking and groaning as though the very foundation was shifting to trap me. I grabbed the journal from my bag, flipping through the pages desperately. The pages were worn, the ink fading, but there was one entry that caught my eye. Asterisk, the house will only release you if you offer something of equal darkness in return. A soul, a life, a piece of your very essence. Asterisk. It hit me like a punch to the gut. The price. But I had no choice. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for what was about to come. The footsteps grew louder, more deafening. The air turned frigid. I could feel the presence closing in. The thing was moving toward me, slowly but surely. I had to act fast. I pulled the journal close to my chest and whispered the words, the ones I had read on the page. I wasn't sure if they would work, but I had to try. I had to do something. And then everything went silent. The air stopped moving. The footsteps vanished. The pressure lifted. I opened my eyes. The figure was gone. For a moment, I thought I had escaped. I thought I was free. But then I heard it. The sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, right behind me. I spun around, but I couldn't see anything. Nothing. The house was empty, silent, too silent. But I could feel it. It wasn't over. I wasn't free. And somehow, I knew asterisk it never would be asterisk. I thought I had escaped. I thought I had broken free, that whatever curse had clung to that house had finally let go of me. But as I stood there in the dark, alone in the silence, I realized just how wrong I was. The house had not let me go. It was asterisk still asterisk with me. I could feel it, like a shadow over my soul. The chill in the air wasn't just the temperature. It was something darker, something colder that seeped into my skin. The house had followed me. No, it wasn't the house. Not exactly. It was asterisk, whatever asterisk had been trapped inside of it. It never truly left. I tried to breathe, tried to steady my heart, but the weight of what I had just done pressed down on me. I had asterisk made a deal asterisk, an unholy, unspeakable deal to escape that house, to break free of its grasp. And now, I was paying the price. The air was still thick with the remnants of the thing that had haunted me. I could feel it, like the faintest whisper in the back of my mind, pulling me back, tugging at my sanity. I wasn't free. I wasn't safe. The sound of my footsteps seemed too loud in the empty space. The house, if you could even call it that anymore, was silent, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy with something unseen. I looked around the room, feeling the familiar weight of dread pressing on my chest. The walls, once so full of life, now felt like they were closing in on me. The air was damp, clinging to my skin, making my clothes stick uncomfortably to my back. I couldn't stay here, not for another second, but I couldn't leave either. The thing in the dark had followed me, just as the journal had warned. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that it was just the stress, the fear that had made me imagine the last few days. But as I stood there, rooted to the spot, I knew it was more than that. The thing, whatever it was, wanted me. It had latched onto me, infected me with its curse, and there was no escaping it. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It was in my thoughts, in my dreams, in my waking moments, twisting my mind, eating away at my sanity. The walls didn't have to be made of stone or brick to trap me. This thing was in my head star. I didn't know how long I stood there, but the next thing I knew, I was back at the door. The front door, the one I had tried to escape through before. I didn't even know how I had gotten there. My body had moved on its own, as though some invisible force had guided me. I reached for the handle, but as soon as my fingers brushed against the cold metal, I felt it, a hand, cold and unyielding, press against my shoulder. I froze. The air around me grew heavier. The weight on my chest intensified, pressing me down. My breath quickened. My heart raced. I knew what was happening, and I knew it was too late. I could feel it, could feel the thing that had been with me from the start, hovering just behind me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and saw nothing. The hallway was empty, just like the rest of the house. Nothing was there, but I felt it. It was always there. The house had never really let me go. I spun back around, desperate, but the door had vanished. Just gone, as if it had never been there at all. The only thing left was the darkness. I backed away slowly, my mind screaming for me to run, but there was nowhere to run to. No place safe. This was it. This was the price I had to pay for whatever pact I had made to escape. A sound, so faint I wasn't sure I'd heard it at all, came from behind me. It was like a sigh, low, deep. It seemed to come from all around me at once. You can't run. The voice, though not truly a voice, reverberated through my skull, chilling me to the core. It wasn't a sound that came from anywhere physical. It was in me, in my mind, in my blood, my very thoughts. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg for mercy, but I couldn't. My throat closed, choked with a fear that twisted deeper and deeper inside me. There was no escape. I had made my deal, and now it was time to collect. The lights flickered, then went out completely, leaving me in the thickest blackness I had ever known. I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed the light, the very air, the space around me. And that was when I felt it, a pressure on my chest, the sensation of something crawling into my skin, invading every inch of my body, taking me over. It was in me now. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move. But when I finally took a step, it was not my body that responded. I wasn't in control anymore, and I don't think I ever will be again. I don't remember how I got out of the house that night. I can't even recall how many hours I wandered in the darkness. My mind, clouded by terror and confusion, couldn't make sense of anything. The world felt strange, disjointed, like I was walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The cold was unbearable, but I couldn't feel it in the usual way. It wasn't just an external chill. It was in my bones, gnawing away at me from the inside. The world around me felt empty, like I had stepped out of reality itself. Every shadow seemed to mock me. Every corner felt alive with unseen eyes watching, waiting for me to slip up. I stumbled through the streets, unsure of where I was or where I was going. I just had to keep moving, had to keep putting one foot in front of the other, hoping to escape the pull that seemed to be dragging me back to the house. But I could still feel it. The house wasn't just a building. It was part of me now, a stain on my soul that I could never wash away. I found myself at the edge of town, standing before a small park, empty and quiet except for the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The bench looked inviting, but I didn't sit. I couldn't. Something in my chest twisted, a tight knot of dread settling deeper and deeper as I looked around. It was as though every corner of this place was wrong, like I didn't belong here anymore. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. I froze, my body instantly tensing. The sound was slow and deliberate, echoing from behind me. I turned around, heart pounding in my chest, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped. I swallowed hard. It was Asterisk still following me star. I could feel it now, like a presence hanging in the air, a weight in my chest, as though something was standing just behind me, breathing, waiting. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I stood there, frozen, unable to move. Asterisk, you can't hide from me. Asterisk. The voice. It came again, but this time it wasn't in my head. It was real, right there, in the air, like someone was whispering in my ear. I spun around, desperate to find the source, but the park remained empty. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking like old bones. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, feel the presence growing stronger, suffocating me. It was in the very air, in every shadow, in every rustle of leaves. It had followed me here. It had never left. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. The footsteps came again, now closer, faster. I ran without thinking, my feet carrying me away from the pack, away from the town, away from everything. But no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I ran, I could always hear it. The footsteps, the whispering voice. It was always there. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of town, where the houses began to thin out, and the forest stretched out in front of me, dark and forbidding. I was out of breath, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The trees in front of me seemed to sway, as though beckoning me, as though they knew what I had done. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to keep moving. I couldn't let it catch me. I couldn't let it consume me. I stumbled into the forest, the darkness swallowing me whole. The trees grew thick, their branches intertwining above, blocking out the light of the moon. I couldn't see where I was going, but it didn't matter. I was being pulled forward, dragged through the underbrush by an invisible force. Then I saw it, a figure. It was standing between the trees, watching me. Its form was indistinct, just a shadow, its features obscured by the dark. But I could feel it. I could feel it, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I stopped, breath caught in my throat. The air was thick with tension, thick with dread. The figure didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through me, pulling at my very soul. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. No one. I turned back to the figure. It hadn't moved. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt trapped, cornered, as though the very air around me was pressing in, closing in, suffocating me. You can't escape me. The voice came again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, stronger. It was coming from all around me, from every direction, from within me. The figure stepped forward, slowly, its movements fluid and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by unseen strings. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs shaking beneath me. It was here. It had found me, and there was no escape. I couldn't breathe. Every part of me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt like it had been frozen in place, trapped under some unseen weight. The air, thick with an oppressive force, felt like it was smothering me. The figure in front of me was closer now, It wasn't just standing in the shadows anymore. It was right there, so close I could almost feel its presence, hear its breath, though I couldn't see its face. The darkness that surrounded it seemed to ripple, as if it were a part of the very fabric of the night itself, an extension of the thing that had haunted me all this time. The forest was eerily silent, except for the faint rustling of the leaves above, which seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't understand. The footsteps, which had followed me relentlessly, had stopped, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was heavy, a suffocating stillness that weighed down on me. I had to move. I had to get away. But still, my body refused to obey. My eyes couldn't leave the figure. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't look away from it. There was something about it, something ancient and wrong, that made my skin crawl. Its form seemed to shift in the darkness, indistinct, like a mirage that would disappear if I blinked. But when I blinked, it was still there, the same eerie presence, unyielding, real. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, choked by fear, as if the very air itself had become thick and heavy with dread. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. They were like holes, empty voids that sucked the light out of everything around them. Then, the figure stepped forward. It wasn't a normal movement. It was like it was gliding, its body never quite touching the ground, as though it were floating above it. I tried to take a step back, but my legs buckled beneath me, and I stumbled. My hands reached out to catch myself, but the ground felt wet, like I was sinking into it. The earth beneath me seemed to shift, becoming softer, almost sponge-like. And then the voice. That voice. Asterisk, you cannot escape me. Asterisk. It was louder now, booming inside my head, as if it had suddenly become a part of me. It was like it was coming from within me, wrapping itself around my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I couldn't think, couldn't move. All I could do was listen to it, feel it, let it fill me up. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the voice was relentless, clawing its way into my mind. Asterisk, you never escaped. Asterisk, it hissed. Asterisk, you just delayed the inevitable. Asterisk. My heart raced, blood pounding in my ears. I could feel the terror, like a cold rush, flowing through me, freezing my limbs, making my chest tight. My thoughts scrambled in the chaos of panic. It was here. It had found me, and I had nowhere to run. The figure was almost upon me now, its presence pressed in on me, suffocating, crushing the air from my lungs. I could feel it, feel asterisk it all around me, like tendrils reaching out to pull me in. My body screamed in protest, begging for escape, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then I heard it, a sound so faint at first that I wasn't sure it was real. A rustling, a scraping sound, like something was dragging itself through the leaves. I opened my eyes, too terrified to close them again. The figure wasn't the only thing there. From the darkness, emerging from the trees like some horrific apparition, came another presence. It was human, or at least it looked that way at first. But as it stepped forward, its features became more distorted, more twisted, like it was trying to mimic the shape of a person, but failing. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight, its eyes wide and unblinking, its mouth hanging open in a grotesque grin. It wasn't a person. It was something asterisk star, and it was coming for me. I finally found my voice, a choked gasp, but it was too late. The shadowy figure loomed over me, blocking out the moonlight. The air was thick with its presence, and I could feel the cold seep into my very bones. My mind raced, but all I could hear, all I could focus on, was the sound of the creature's footsteps. I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. And the only thing that seemed real, the only thing I could comprehend, was the overwhelming feeling that it had always been this way, that I had always been here trapped in this moment, with no way out. Then, a voice cut through the stillness, a voice that wasn't the figure's, It was the same voice I had heard when I first encountered the house, the same voice from the journal. Asterisk, you should never have come here. Asterisk. The voice was familiar, but distant, like an echo from the past. It carried with it an ancient, malevolent power, and it filled the space around me, vibrating through my bones. The figure's shadow stretched toward me, its presence becoming unbearable, suffocating. And I realized then, with a clarity that chilled me to the core, that I wasn't just running from the house anymore. I was running from something much older, something that had been waiting for asterisk me star. I could feel the weight of it, the presence closing in on me. It was a tangible force, like the air itself had become thick with malevolence. Every breath felt heavier, harder to take, as though the very atmosphere was trying to suffocate me, to drown me in its darkness. My heart hammered in my chest, my pulse a frantic drumbeat as I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to escape. The figure loomed over me, its shape becoming clearer with each passing second, like a nightmare slowly coming to life. It wasn't human, not in any way I could comprehend. Its form seemed to shift, like smoke swirling in the wind, but with a solidity that didn't belong in this world. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were deep, dark voids, nothing but endless, swirling darkness that seemed to consume everything around them. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. Asterisk, your mind, asterisk, the voice whispered again, soft yet deafening in my ears. Asterisk always have been. Asterisk. I couldn't understand it. Why? Why me? What had I done to deserve this? The questions spun in my mind, but they offered no answers. There was only asterisk this star, only the dark, suffocating presence pressing in from all sides, closing the walls around me until I could hardly breathe. The creature took another step closer, and with it, a wave of cold so intense that it felt as though the very temperature had dropped below freezing. My breath came out in a mist, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. But it wasn't just a cold. It was the asterisk feeling, asterisk, the overwhelming sensation that I was standing at the edge of something ancient and terrifying, something far beyond my understanding. I could feel its hands reaching for me, long, skeletal fingers that stretched out from its body like tendrils, slowly, inexorably. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But the fear, the terror was paralyzing. It had me in its grip, and I couldn't break free. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift again, as if the earth itself were alive, bending and twisting, pulling me down into the depths. My body felt heavier with every passing second, as though I was sinking into the very soul, being swallowed by the darkness. Asterisk, it's too late for you, asterisk, the voice murmured. Asterisk, you should have never left. Asterisk. The air was thick with those words, and it was then that I realized, asterisk, this was its star. This was the end. There was no escaping it, no running. The house, the curse, the thing that had haunted me since the moment I moved in. It had been waiting for me, pulling me in, slowly tightening its grip until I couldn't break free. The figure was so close now that I could feel its cold breath against my skin, its presence so overwhelming that it felt like it was asterisk inside asterisk me, crawling under my skin, through my veins. I could almost hear its thoughts in my head, whispering things I didn't understand, things I didn't want to hear. Then, just as the darkness seemed to swallow me whole, there was a sudden shift, a snap like a cord being severed. The world around me seemed to flicker, like a bad connection on an old TV. One moment, the creature was right in front of me, and the next, it was gone. The darkness faded, the pressure lifting. The cold receded, and the oppressive weight that had been suffocating me vanished. I gasped, sucking in air, my chest heaving as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. But then, a sound, a voice, a whisper. Asterisk, you can't run from me. Asterisk. It came from behind me, soft, almost gentle. The tone was chilling, the words so simple, so calm, yet filled with an unfathomable terror. I turned around, But there was no one there. No figure. No shadows. Just the forest, silent and still, as though nothing had happened at all. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body trembling uncontrollably, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just experienced. Was it real? Had it been a dream? But deep down, I knew it was real. And I had left the house, but the house had never left me. I stumbled back toward the town, my legs barely able to support me, my mind reeling. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to keep moving, had to get away from everything, from the house, from the curse. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still with me, that whatever had been in that house, whatever had followed me, was still out there, waiting, watching. And as I walked, the footsteps came again, slow, deliberate, right behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the empty street, the silent houses, and the dark sky above. But I knew the truth now. I had never escaped. Whatever haunted that house, whatever curse it held, had followed me, and it was never going to let me go. Story 2. The first night in the house felt oddly quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence that wraps around you like a thick fog, making everything feel heavier, like the air itself is waiting for something to happen. I had just moved in, single, recently divorced, and looking for a fresh start. I needed a change of scenery, something far enough from everything I knew. When I found this old house, it felt like the perfect escape. The place was cheap, too cheap, really, but it was in a nice, quiet neighborhood, and the landlord seemed nice enough. He was an older man, thin and hunched, his eyes darting nervously as he handed me the keys. "It's a good place," he said with a shaky smile, almost like he was trying to convince himself more than me. "Not many people stay long, but it's just a house, right?" I should have asked more questions. I didn't. The house was an old 2-story with peeling paint, creaking floorboards, and windows that rattled when the wind blew. But all these little quirks seemed normal, I guess. It had that vintage charm, the kind that feels like a piece of the past is still living within the walls. I started unloading boxes and setting up the place, trying to make it mine, but it felt like I was merely borrowing space from something much older than me. The first few days were uneventful. I got into a routine, unpacked the essentials, and spent hours trying to make the house feel less lonely. It didn't help that everything seemed a bit off. The floorboards creaked even when I wasn't walking on them. At night, I'd hear noises from the upstairs, the odd sound of something moving, but I chalked it up to an old house settling. On my third day, I met Mrs. Carter, the neighbor. She lived next door, a small cottage-like house with a front porch that had seen better days. She was friendly, middle-aged with graying hair, and offered me some freshly baked cookies. She seemed harmless enough, but when she learned I'd moved into the old house, her expression shifted slightly. "You know," she said, sipping her tea, "I've been here for a while, and I've seen people come and go. That house of yours, it's been empty for a couple of years now. I don't know why anyone would want to move into it after the last person left." I raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" Mrs. Carter's eyes flicked toward the window, as if to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "People talk. They say that house is cursed. The last tenant, poor thing, he was a mess. Ran out one night, babbling about curses and footsteps in the walls. He was completely out of his mind, but people say he was hearing things. Bad things. The house, it doesn't like people staying for too long." I chuckled nervously, brushing it off. "It's just an old house, right? These things happen." But the unease lingered as I went back to my house. I couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable every time I walked past that old house at the end of the street. Mrs. Carter's words echoed in my head, though I tried to convince myself it was all superstition. That night, as I settled into bed, The house creaked and groaned like it always did. But this time, it was different. The noises upstairs didn't stop after a few minutes. There was something distinct about the sound, a slow, deliberate thud, like someone walking through the room above me, dragging their feet across the floor. I rolled over, staring at the ceiling. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe the house was just settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was upstairs. The next morning, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Old houses do that to you, don't they? They make you think you're hearing things, seeing things. But later that day, I met another neighbor, a young guy who lived a few doors down. He didn't know much about the house's history, but he mentioned a rumor he'd heard. "Yeah, I heard some weird stuff about that place," he said, scratching his head. "My buddy said he was over there once and heard footsteps in the hall, but when he looked, no one was there. Kind of freaked him out. But that place is just old, right? Nothing to worry about." I smiled and nodded, trying to laugh it off. But the unease was starting to build. What was it about this house? Why did it feel like something was always watching? Later that evening, I sat in my living room, trying to distract myself with TV. I kept hearing that same sound, footsteps above me, and this time, they weren't slow or dragging. They were quick, urgent, like someone was pacing back and forth in the room above mine. I stood up, heart racing, and slowly walked up the stairs, my footsteps barely making a sound. The second floor was silent. The room above mine was empty. Nothing was there. I stood in the middle of the room for a while, listening to the silence, my mind racing for an explanation. When I returned downstairs, I found a note on my kitchen table, one that hadn't been there before. "It's not the house. It's you." My blood ran cold. I stared at the note, my fingers trembling slightly as I ran them over the paper. It wasn't my handwriting. I didn't even know who would have left it. The words were simple, but they hit me with an unsettling force, like someone had just whispered a secret meant only for me. Asterisk, it's not the house. It's you. Asterisk. I scanned the room, expecting to find someone standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. The house felt empty, eerily so, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't an unfamiliar feeling. It had been that way ever since I'd moved in, a sense of being watched, of not being alone, even when the place seemed deserted. I folded the note and stuffed it in my pocket, my mind racing. I hadn't seen anyone, but that didn't mean someone wasn't watching me. I wasn't sure who or what, but something about the house was different, more unsettling than I'd first thought. I tried to shake it off and went about my evening routine. I made dinner, ate in silence, and settled on the couch to watch TV. As the evening wore on, I found myself growing more and more anxious, unable to shake the thought that I was being followed, or at least observed. The footsteps from the night before were still fresh in my mind. They had felt so real, so deliberate. As the hours passed, the house seemed to come alive around me. The creaks of the floorboards grew louder. A door I hadn't opened stood ajar, swaying slightly. The air grew colder, and the familiar hum of the refrigerator seemed distant, replaced by a strange stillness that clung to the room like a thick fog. I was about to get up and check on the door when I heard something new, a faint tapping from upstairs. It wasn't the kind of tapping that came from the house settling. It was rhythmic, like someone tapping a finger against wood. Slowly, I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, my breath shallow as I reached the bottom of the staircase. The tapping continued, faint but persistent. It was coming from the room at the end of the hall. I took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, trying to steady my nerves. When I reached the top, the air felt even colder, like a chill had settled into the bones of the house itself. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the windows. I could see the door at the end of the hall, the one that had always seemed just a little too dark, a little too inviting in a way I couldn't explain. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached the door. I froze. Something was inside. I was sure of it. I slowly turned the doorknob, expecting resistance, but it opened easily, creaking slightly as I stepped into the room. The space was small, almost claustrophobic, with an old-fashioned dresser in one corner and a faded rug in the middle of the floor. The room was empty, except for one thing, a journal. It sat on the dresser, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was cracked, the leather worn and frayed. Something about it drew me in, and before I could stop myself, I reached out and picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the pages, a cold sensation shot up my spine, and the room seemed to darken. I flipped open the journal, and the first page was filled with handwritten words, cramped and hurried. Asterisk, I hear them every night. Footsteps, voices. I can't tell if it's the house or something else, but it's always there, waiting for me to slip. I've tried everything to stop it, but nothing works. I think it's too late now. The door is open, and I've let something in. Asterisk. I felt my heart skip a beat. The words were erratic, almost frantic. I flipped to the next page. Asterisk, the rituals didn't help. I thought I could stop it, but it only made it worse. There's a curse on this house, a curse that won't let go. It feeds on fear. It waits for you to crack. I think it's watching me, watching all of us. Asterisk. I turned another page. The handwriting was messier now, more desperate. Asterisk, I don't know how much longer I can last. I hear the footsteps, always at night, just outside my door. I'm not sure if it's the house or if it's something more. Whatever it is, it's not human. I need to get out, but I can't. The house won't let me. It won't let anyone leave. Asterisk. The last page was blank. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. I suddenly felt very small in that room, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I had no idea who had written this or when, but I knew one thing for certain. The person who had lived here before me had experienced something terrible, something I couldn't begin to comprehend. I placed the journal back on the dresser, but as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the corner of the room. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting slowly across the wall. It wasn't a trick of the light. It moved, purposefully, like it had a shape, like it was something alive. Before I could react, the shadow vanished, leaving only the eerie stillness behind. My heart raced as I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop to think, didn't stop to catch my breath. I just ran downstairs, straight out the front door. But as I stepped outside, I froze. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I glanced back at the house, the windows dark and empty, and then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my heart thundering in my chest as I hurried away from the house. The footsteps behind me seemed to follow at a steady pace, matching my frantic steps, growing louder with every breath I took. It wasn't just in my head. Someone, or something, was there, trailing me. Yet when I stole a glance over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the dark stretch of the street and the empty houses. The air felt suffocating, as if the weight of the night was pressing down on me, crushing the last remnants of sanity I had left. My breath came out in sharp gasps, my skin prickling with an unseen presence. I kept walking, faster now, but the sound of those footsteps never stopped, never faltered. They were right behind me. I stumbled and nearly tripped over my own feet as I reached the corner of the street, turning sharply to face the rower houses. But still, the footsteps echoed in the quiet night. It wasn't possible. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was someone messing with me? Was it all in my head? But deep down, I knew better. I had felt it. The cold, oppressive atmosphere. The unmistakable sensation that something was stalking me, just out of sight. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get away from it all. but I had nowhere to go. This house, this cursed place, had become a part of me. It had dug its claws into my mind, leaving me with nowhere to turn. I didn't stop until I reached the park at the end of the block, where the streetlights cast long shadows over the empty benches. I slowed my pace, gasping for breath, and finally dared to turn around. The street was empty, no one in sight, no footsteps, just the quiet rustling of trees in the distance. But the feeling didn't go away. I stayed at the park for hours, unable to shake the image of the shadow I'd seen in that room. The way it had moved, deliberate and alive. It was like it was waiting for me, watching me from the corners of my mind. The journal I'd found, it couldn't be a coincidence. Whoever had lived in that house before me had written about the same things I was experiencing now. The footsteps, the shadow, the feeling of being watched. I couldn't stay at the park forever, though. The cold air bit at my skin, and my legs were stiff from the adrenaline. Slowly, I forced myself to walk back toward the house. The sky had shifted, the first light of dawn barely peeking over the horizon, but there was no comfort in the morning light, only dread. As I neared the house, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was wide open. I had locked it the night before. I was sure of it, but now it was ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze. The house looked just as it always did from the outside, silent, still, but now it felt more like a threat than a home. My fingers hovered over the door handle as I stood there, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What if whatever had been following me was inside? What if it had come back? I couldn't stay out here forever, though. I didn't have the strength to face the world outside the house, not anymore. I stepped inside, cautiously, the air immediately feeling colder than it should have been. The familiar creaks of the floorboards greeted me, but there was something different now. The house felt heavier, like something had changed. The silence was more suffocating than before, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, thicker. I stood in the hallway, listening for any sign of movement. The footsteps from earlier seemed to echo in my mind, but there was nothing now, just the overwhelming silence. But then I heard it again, a soft thud from upstairs. I wasn't imagining it this time. It was clear, distinct. Someone, or something, was up there. I made my way up the stairs, my body trembling, my breath shallow. The air grew colder as I climbed, each step creaking under my weight. The door to the room where I had found the journal was still closed, but now it seemed to be calling to me. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, trying to steady my shaking hands. The room seemed darker than before, the shadows longer, stretching across the floor. I didn't want to go in, didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me in that room. But I couldn't leave without answers. I needed to know what was happening. I slowly reached for the door handle, and as my fingers brushed the cool metal, I heard it again, the soft tapping, like a single finger rapping on wood. It was coming from inside the room. I froze. My mind raced, fighting against the panic that was creeping up on me. What could I do? What was in there? With a shaky breath, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the journal was gone. Panic surged through me, my heart hammering in my chest as I scanned the room, my eyes wild. The dresser was still there, the rug still in place, but the journal, the one that had been sitting on the dresser the night before, was gone. I turned in a circle, searching for any sign of where it had gone. There was no way it could have disappeared on its own. No way. But then I heard it, a whisper, a low, breathless sound, like someone speaking just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Asterisk, it's too late now. Asterisk. The words came from nowhere, and yet it felt like they had been inside my head all along. I stumbled backward, knocking over the dresser in a panic. The room was spinning, my mind unraveling as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind, or was there something else, something dark, living in this house, waiting for me to finally break. I didn't stay long enough to find out. I ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door, not stopping until I was halfway down the block. And as I looked back, I saw something at the window. A shadow, a shape, watching me, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. There was no way I could. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow at the window, staring at me, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been there long before I ever stepped foot in that house. I spent hours sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of everything. The whispering, the footsteps, the missing journal. It all felt like I was living in some twisted nightmare. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just run. I couldn't keep pretending that everything would go back to normal. There was something darker at play here, something that I couldn't escape by simply moving out. I needed answers. The next day, I went to the local library. I hadn't been in town long enough to get to know many people, but I had heard whispers of the house's history from the few locals I had met. One person, an older woman at the corner store, had mentioned something about the house being cursed, about the strange things that had happened there over the years. I had dismissed it as superstition at the time, but now I couldn't afford to ignore it. The library was quiet, the musty smell of old books filling the air as I wandered through the aisles. I finally found a section on local history, where old newspaper clippings and town records were stored in dusty boxes. I pulled out a few files and started flipping through them. It didn't take long before I found the article I was looking for. The headline was chilling. Asterisk family found dead in mysterious circumstances. House on Elm Street abandoned asterisk. The article described a tragic event that had occurred years ago in the very house I was living in. A family of 4 had been found dead, their bodies twisted in unnatural positions, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death. The police had been baffled, but the townspeople whispered that something darker was involved. Some said it was a curse. Others claimed it was the work of the occult. I read through more articles, each one more unsettling than the last. Apparently, the family had been the final victims of a long line of tragedies tied to the house. The original owner, a man named Arthur Stiles, was said to have been obsessed with the occult. He had lived alone for years, performing strange rituals and experiments in the house. The rumors suggested that he had opened a doorway to something otherworldly, something that now haunted the house. As I dug deeper, I found mention of a journal, Arthur's journal. It was said to contain descriptions of his rituals and the dark forces he had summoned. Some believed that his death, which had occurred under mysterious circumstances, was a result of his tampering with things beyond human understanding. And after his death, the house had been abandoned for years, until it was bought by the family who had died there. The more I read, the more I realized that the journal I had found in the house was not just a random collection of writings. It was the key. Arthur's journal held the answers to everything, including the curse that had been placed on the house. But I couldn't understand everything just by reading about it. I needed to see the journal again to figure out what the missing pages meant, and to find out what it was that Arthur had done to open that door. But when I got back to the house, I was faced with something even more terrifying. The front door was wide open. I froze on the sidewalk, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no way I had left it open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. And yet, here it was, wide open, as if inviting me back inside. I didn't want to go in, but I had no choice. The answers were inside that house, and I wasn't going to stop until I had them. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing through the hallway as I made my way toward the living room. The house felt different now, colder, more oppressive. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, heavier, like they were alive and watching me. I entered the room where I had found the journal, but to my horror, it was gone again. My breath caught in my throat. The journal was nowhere to be found. I searched frantically, tearing through the room, knocking over furniture, and throwing open drawers. It was as if the journal had vanished into thin air. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I froze, my blood running cold. The sound wasn't human. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. The air grew colder still, and I felt a pressure on my chest, like a hand was slowly, deliberately squeezing the life out of me. I could barely breathe as the growling grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my ears, and I couldn't move. I was trapped, locked in a room with something I couldn't see, but could feel, creeping toward me. The walls seemed to close in around me, the house groaning and creaking as if it were alive, responding to the presence that was now in the room with me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the growl stopped. Silence. I waited, holding my breath, my mind racing. I didn't dare move. And then I heard it, the soft sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was pacing in the next room. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't. I turned and ran, tearing through the house, down the stairs, and out the front door. The world outside was a blur as I ran down the street, not stopping until I reached the park again. My legs were weak, my breath shallow, but there was no escaping what I had felt in that house. The curse wasn't just in the walls. It was inside me now, and it wasn't going to let me go. I didn't know what to do anymore. The house had me. It always had. But I still had to find the journal. The truth was in there, buried somewhere deep. If I didn't, I feared I would never escape. I couldn't sleep that night. The thought of the house, the growl, the footsteps, the missing journal, kept me wide awake, tossing and turning in my bed. I had tried to shake it off, but the weight of it all was too much. The house was like a dark presence in my life now, something I couldn't ignore. I knew I had to go back. I had no choice. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going back to that house to find the journal, no matter what. I couldn't let it slip away again, and I needed answers. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how connected the journal was to everything. Arthur Styles' obsession with the occult, the strange deaths, the haunting presence that lingered. It was all tied to that book, and I had to find it. I arrived at the house early in the morning, when the sun was just beginning to rise. The place looked empty and abandoned, as it always had, but now there was an unnatural stillness to it. The air felt thick, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped inside, the door creaking as I pushed it open. I expected to hear the usual sounds, the groaning of the floorboards, the distant creak of the stairs, but there was nothing. No sounds at all. The house was eerily silent, as if it was holding some kind of secret. I made my way to the living room, where I had found the journal before. I immediately noticed something strange. The furniture that had once been in disarray, the knocked-over chairs, the scattered books, was now perfectly in place. It was as if the house itself had reset, as if it had wiped away any trace of my previous search. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. I went to the bookshelf, where I had last seen the journal. My heart sank when I saw that it was gone again. I wasn't surprised, though. The house had a way of taking things when it wanted to. But this time, I wasn't leaving without it. I turned the room upside down, checking every corner, every drawer, every hidden space I could think of. I wasn't going to give up. Then, just as I was about to check behind the fireplace, I heard something. A faint noise coming from upstairs, the softest creak of a floorboard. I froze. It wasn't the house settling. It was too deliberate, too steady. It was the sound of someone walking. I didn't want to go upstairs. I didn't want to find out who or what was up there. But I couldn't stay here. I had to know. I had to face whatever was waiting for me. I climbed the stairs, my feet dragging, the old wood groaning under my weight. The house felt different up here, colder somehow, as if the walls were closing in on me. I walked down the hallway, the same narrow corridor where I had felt the presence before. The door to the master bedroom was cracked open, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out into the hall. I hesitated, but only for a moment. I couldn't turn back now. I pushed the door open, and immediately I felt it. The cold, the heaviness in the air. It was thicker than it had ever been before, suffocating. The room was empty, but the journal wasn't on the bed, or the desk, or the shelves. It was nowhere to be found, and that's when I saw it. A dark stain on the floor. It wasn't big, but it was unmistakable. A blotch of something, a mark that hadn't been there before. I crouched down, my heart racing, and reached out to touch it. It was still wet, and it smelled wrong. Not like blood, but something more foul, more ancient. I jerked my hand back, my mind spinning. What was this? What had happened in this room? Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me, cold and heavy. I turned, but there was nothing. Just empty air. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, a pressure, like something was standing right next to me, breathing down my neck. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat was tight, my chest constricting. I knew it was here. It had been here all along, waiting, watching. The journal was the key. The journal was the only thing that could explain what was happening. But it was gone. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on the floorboards. As I tried to steady myself, I heard something faint but unmistakable, the sound of pages turning, the unmistakable rustle of paper. I spun around, heart hammering. The journal was there, sitting on the nightstand by the bed. I didn't hesitate. I rushed over to it, nearly tearing it from the table. As soon as my hands touched it, I felt a cold rush of energy course through me, like a wave of ice water crashing over my skin. I opened the journal, my eyes scanning the pages, desperate for answers. But instead of words, I found drawings. Strange, intricate symbols. Diagrams that seemed to pulse with some kind of energy. And then, at the very end, a single line written in bold, shaking script. Asterisk, it never leaves. It never forgets. The door is always open. Asterisk, the chill in the room deepened. I could hear the whispering again, but this time it was louder, clearer. It wasn't just in my head. The voice was coming from somewhere, close, right behind me. I slammed the journal shut, but the whispering continued, louder now, growing into a hiss, a breath on the back of my neck. And then I felt it, a weight, heavy, pressing down on the bed, just beside me. The unmistakable sensation of something, or someone, sitting on the edge of the mattress. I didn't dare look. I didn't want to see what was behind me, but I knew it was there. The weight on the bed was unbearable, suffocating. It felt as though the very air was being sucked out of the room, leaving me lightheaded and dizzy. The whispering grew louder, twisting into unintelligible mutterings, an ancient chant that felt like it was being etched into my mind. I didn't move. I couldn't. It was as though my body was paralyzed by the presence, by the force that had settled beside me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat deafening, drowning out the sound of the whispers. The only thing I could focus on was the oppressive cold, the feeling of being watched. And then, with no warning, the bed creaked. The unmistakable sound of weight shifting, as if the thing next to me had stood up. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, and my hands trembled as they gripped the journal. I had to leave. I had to get out. But the door to the room, was so far away. It felt like it would take an eternity to get there. The whispers continued, growing louder, like a swarm of bees circling my head. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them pressing in on me. They were calling me, beckoning me to do something, to move, to listen. I couldn't resist any longer. I had to know what was behind me, what was causing the weight on the bed. I turned, my head slowly, unwillingly, my eyes searching the room. There was nothing, nothing visible, but I felt it. Something intangible, something I couldn't see but could feel deep in my bones. The air had thickened around me, and the shadows seemed to stretch, warping in the corners of the room. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, just a flicker, but unmistakable. A shape that seemed to shimmer in the darkness, standing in the far corner of the room. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what I had seen. Had it been real, or was it my mind playing tricks on me, overwhelmed by the terror and the weight of what I had uncovered? But the house had been strange from the beginning, hadn't it? The creaking floors, the strange smells, the cold spots. This wasn't normal. The house wasn't just old, it was something else. Something ancient. I looked at the journal again, my fingers trembling as I flipped through its pages. The symbols, the strange writings, they all pointed to something. Something that Arthur Styles had opened. Something he had unleashed. I felt a pang of dread deep in my chest. What if the journal wasn't just a record of his obsessions? What if it was more than that? What if it was a warning? The door. The journal had mentioned a door. The door that had always been open. What did that mean? A door to what? My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp noise. A sound I had heard before. A scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It came from behind the walls, distant but unmistakable. It was a scratching, an animal trapped inside the walls, or something else. I stood up quickly, nearly tripping over the bedspread. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run far away from this place, but the house had already done its damage. I couldn't escape it. Not now. Not after everything I had uncovered. I had to find out what was hidden in the walls, what had been buried there all these years. I grabbed the journal and rushed toward the door. The floorboards creaked under my feet, the familiar sounds of the house now taking on a menacing tone. The scraping noise continued, getting louder, coming closer. I moved faster, heading toward the staircase, but as I reached the hallway, something stopped me in my tracks. The front door. It was wide open. I hadn't opened it. No one had. I didn't even hear it creak open. The door had simply swung wide, as if something was waiting for me to walk through it. I hesitated, my body screaming at me to stay away, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. I stepped cautiously toward the door, glancing behind me as the sound of scraping grew closer. It was right there, behind the walls, right beneath my feet. And then, just as I reached the door, I saw it. A figure, a shadow standing in the threshold, blocking my way. I froze. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, his features hidden in the dark. But I could feel him. I could feel the weight of his presence, the oppressive energy that radiated from him. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. My body refused to move. I was paralyzed by fear. The scraping noise stopped. Everything went silent. And then, slowly, the figure raised a hand. He pointed at me. It wasn't a gesture of warning. It was a command, a silent demand for me to follow him. I didn't want to. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body didn't obey. I stepped forward, drawn toward the figure as if I were tethered to him. He never moved, never spoke, but the silence between us was deafening. I reached out toward the door, my hand trembling, my breath shallow, but before I could grasp the handle, the figure disappeared, vanished into thin air, and just like that, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. I turned, panic surging through me, and raced toward the stairs. The door to the basement, the one I hadn't noticed before, was wide open. A deep, dark hole in the floor, stretching into the earth below. I knew I had to go down there. I had to find out what was hidden in the darkness. But I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't cooperate. The weight of the house was bearing down on me. The air felt thick, like it was closing in. And then, from the darkness of the basement, I heard it. A whisper. My name. And it wasn't mine. The whisper stopped as suddenly as it had begun, but the chill in the air remained. My heart pounded against my chest, frantic and unrelenting. I stood frozen, staring at the open basement door, as if some invisible force was pulling me toward it. The air in the house felt thicker now, heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in, pressing down on me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But all I could do was stand there, my feet cemented to the floor. I didn't know what to do. The house, this damn house, had already taken everything from me. My peace, my sense of safety. And now, it was threatening to take my sanity. The whisper had been so clear, so distinct. My name, but it wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was hollow, empty, like it had come from the deepest recesses of the house, of the darkness below. I took a cautious step forward, then another. My legs felt weak, my hands clammy, but I couldn't stop. The basement door loomed before me, an open maw that seemed to beckon me. Without thinking, I stepped down into the dark, the air growing colder with each descent. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the silence like a warning. The light above me flickered, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to twist and stretch along the walls. The whisper came again, this time softer, almost like a sigh. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat, my gaze darting around. The basement seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with nothing but shadows and the scent of musty, damp earth. I felt like I was stepping into another world, one that existed outside the normal rules of time and space. The light above flickered once more, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting just out of reach. I froze. The sensation of being watched gripped me so tightly that I couldn't breathe. Another step. I was now at the bottom of the stairs, staring into the basement, unable to tear my gaze away from the dark corner where the shadow had vanished. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me to run, to leave. But I couldn't. I had to know. I had to know what had been hidden here, what the house was trying to tell me. I took another step forward, and then another, until I stood in the middle of the basement. The floor beneath my feet was cold, and the air had a metallic taste, like the very house itself was alive, breathing with me. Suddenly, I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it was clearer, more urgent. My name was repeated, dragged out, like a plea, a beckoning. I spun around, my eyes wild, searching for the source. And then I saw it. On the far wall, hidden beneath the shadows, was a door. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Old, crooked, covered in strange symbols that looked like they had been burned into the wood. The door wasn't part of the house. It didn't belong here. I couldn't move. My mind screamed for me to turn away, but my feet moved of their own accord. The whisper intensified, the sound becoming deafening in my ears. My pulse quickened. It was as though the house itself was alive, suffocating me with its presence. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stop, but I was already moving, my hand reaching out for the cold metal handle. The door creaked open with a groan, and as it did, a sudden gust of cold air rushed out from within, blowing my hair back and freezing the very breath in my lungs. I hesitated for just a moment, but that moment was enough to break the spell. I stepped into the room, my feet dragging on the cold, uneven floor. The room was small, cramped, and empty, except for a single, large stone altar in the center. The altar was covered in old, dried blood, its surface marked with symbols I recognized from the journal. I stepped closer, my eyes fixed on the altar. There were several objects arranged carefully around it. Candles, bones, old photographs that had long since begun to yellow and fade. But it was the center of the altar that caught my attention, a dark, jagged stone, shaped like a skull. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. But just as my hand was about to touch the stone, I heard a sound. A sharp crack, like the snapping of bones, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. But there was nothing, just the empty, suffocating air of the basement, heavy with the weight of forgotten rituals and dark secrets. Then the whisper came again, only this time it wasn't from the walls or the shadows. It was behind me, right in my ear. "Leave," the voice hissed, its breath cold against my skin. I didn't need to be told twice. My instincts took over, and I turned, stumbling back toward the door. The room seemed to shift, like the walls were closing in on me. The altar, the stone, everything blurred together as I raced up the stairs, my legs threatening to give way beneath me. The basement door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I looked around, my mind reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The house had always been strange, but now it felt like a living, breathing thing, with eyes that watched me from every corner. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave, but as I reached for the front door, I heard it again. A whisper, soft, familiar. "Leave, now." I turned slowly, my heart sinking into my stomach. The figure from the basement, the shadow that had pointed at me, he was standing in the doorway, and this time his face was visible. A skull, hollow and empty, with eyes that burned like fire. It was him, the one who had opened the door all those years ago, the one who had never left. And now, neither would I. I don't know how I managed to get out of the house. My legs were shaking, my chest tight, but somehow I stumbled to the front door and threw it open, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The darkness outside was thick, pressing in on all sides, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating grip the house had on me. I ran, not caring about where I was going, just needing to get away from the house, from the skull-faced figure, from whatever had been following me for the last few weeks. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the yard, where the dim streetlights of the neighborhood offered a fleeting sense of safety. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, watching me from the shadows, just out of sight. I could almost hear its breath, soft and slow, like it was waiting for the right moment to strike. I turned back to look at the house, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, waiting for me to return. But the house was still, silent, no movement, no shadows in the windows. For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined it all. The whispers, the footsteps, the figure. Maybe it was all just a result of my exhaustion, the stress of everything that had happened since I'd moved in. But then I saw it. A single light flickered in the top window of the house. Just one. I knew that light had not been on when I left. I would have noticed. The sensation of being watched intensified, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, wanting to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't bring myself to dial a number. The house still held me in its grip, even from a distance. I stood there for a long time, staring at the house, as the light flickered again, this time more violently, like it was calling to me, daring me to return. I should have left then. I should have kept running, gotten as far away as possible. But I couldn't. There was something inside me, a deep compulsion, that pulled me back. The house wanted me to come back. It knew I would. And so, like a moth to a flame, I turned and walked back toward the front door, each step heavier than the last. The closer I got to the house, the more suffocating the air became. The light in the window flickered again, this time followed by a low creaking sound, like the house itself was stretching and groaning in anticipation. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking, but before I could touch it, the door opened on its own, a thin crack appearing between the frame and the wall. My heart raced. I stood frozen, staring at the darkness beyond. The house was inviting me in, but I knew better. I had to leave, for good. But something pulled me inside, a pull I couldn't resist, as if the house itself had claimed me as its next victim. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with an eerie finality. The house was silent once more. I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence in the air, thick and oppressive. I could hear the creaking of the floorboards, the soft shuffle of feet. No, not feet, but something else, dragging across the wood. My eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing, just the empty, suffocating silence of the house. And then it came. A cold gust of air rushed past me, the temperature dropping to an unbearable degree. My breath came out in visible clouds. I turned sharply, the hairs on my arms standing up, but once again there was nothing, except for the whispers. They were everywhere now, surrounding me. They slithered into my ears, their voices low and guttural, like something old and forgotten was speaking from the very walls of the house. "Leave," they whispered over and over, like a chant. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I was paralyzed, trapped in the house's grip, unable to escape its hold. And then the shadows moved. I couldn't see it clearly at first, but out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of someone, moving just beyond my vision. A figure, tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light, but its presence unmistakable. It was there, watching me, waiting. The figure stepped forward, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face, if you could even call it that. It was a skull, just like the one I had seen in the basement, hollow, with empty eyes that seemed to stare straight into my soul. I screamed. I don't know how I managed to, but the sound ripped through the silence, breaking the trance the house had over me. I turned to run, but the house was no longer just a house. It was a maze, its walls shifting and warping as I tried to make my way to the door. Every hallway was longer than it should have been. Every corner I turned led me into another dark, empty room. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were all around me now, in my head, in my bones. I could feel them crawling under my skin, dragging me down into the depths of the house. And then I saw the door, the front door, but it wasn't the same. It was cracked open, the space between the door and the frame too narrow for me to fit through. It was like the house had become alive, breathing, changing. I ran toward it anyway, desperate to escape. But as I reached for the door, I heard it. A single, low, guttural laugh. The door slammed shut in my face, trapping me inside once again. I turned around, my eyes wide with terror, and I saw him again. The figure with the skull face. This time, he wasn't alone. There were others. Shadows, faces twisted in pain and fear, all gathered around me. They were trapped here, just like I was, and they were waiting for me to join them. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed under the weight of the house, under the weight of the things that were watching me, waiting for me. The air was thick with something dark and oppressive. I tried to move, but it was like the walls were closing in, pushing me toward the center of the room where the shadows gathered, their hollow eyes staring at me, beckoning me to join them. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my mind desperately searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The house had me. One of the figures stepped forward, its form hazy, like a mirage. It was tall, too tall, with arms that stretched unnaturally long, fingers ending in sharp, gnarled tips. I could feel its presence even before it spoke, the air growing colder still, the whispers intensifying in my mind. "You should have left," the figure said, its voice an eerie blend of many voices, layered on top of each other. "Now, you are part of us." I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to obey. My body was numb, frozen in place by some force stronger than my will. I could feel their eyes on me, See the way they reached out, drawn to me as if I were the missing piece they had been waiting for. Leave now, or you'll become one of us, the figure repeated, and its lips curled into a twisted grin, revealing teeth too sharp, too long. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the vision of the twisted figure, trying to push the fear away. But it was impossible. The fear was inside me now, wrapping around my heart, squeezing tighter with every passing second. Then, a low rumble echoed through the house, shaking the walls. The temperature dropped again, and I could feel the cold sinking into my bones. The whispers shifted, taking on an even more sinister tone, their words now a chant, a ritual. Blood must be spilled. The door must be opened. I didn't understand. Blood? What door? What were they talking about? The figure stepped closer, its eyes burning with a cold fire that sent a chill down my spine. The one who opened the door must close it, it said, its voice dropping to a whisper. But you must give something in return. I could feel my pulse in my throat, panic flooding my senses. I was suffocating. I needed to get out, to escape, but the walls around me seemed to press in tighter and tighter. The figure reached out, a long, skeletal hand grasping at the air near my face. Its touch sent an icy shock through my skin, and the room swam with dark shadows, twisting and turning around me, like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The house calls to you, it hissed. You are its next sacrifice. I backed away, trying to put distance between myself and the figure, but the room seemed to stretch, the walls moving like the ripples on water. The shadows shifted and writhed, closing in on me from every direction. And then I saw it, a door, hidden in the shadows. I hadn't noticed it before, but it was there, now, standing open. The figure's eyes gleamed with malicious intent as it reached toward me once more. Come, take your place. My body moved on its own, pulled toward the door, as though the house itself was commanding me. My feet dragged across the floor, but I couldn't stop. I didn't want to go. I couldn't, but it didn't matter. My body was no longer my own. I reached the door, and the cold air beyond it hit me like a wave, sending a shiver down my spine. I could hear it now, voices, chanting, whispering. They were coming from the other side of the door, from the dark, endless abyss that lay beyond. I stepped forward, my foot crossing the threshold, and everything went silent. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, but the silence was deafening. It felt wrong. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the entire house, and I was plunged into complete darkness. But I wasn't alone. The whispers began again, and I felt them all around me. Thousands of voices, each one more desperate than the last. They were reaching for me, touching my skin, clawing at my mind. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, echoing through the dark. But they weren't my own. They were something else, something that had been following me, hunting me, ever since I had moved in. And then I felt it, a presence, cold and heavy, standing behind me. I didn't dare turn around. It reached out with a cold, clammy hand, brushing against my shoulder, and I froze, unable to move. You should never have come here, the voice whispered in my ear. It wasn't a whisper. It was a scream from the depths of hell itself. I was going to die here. I was going to become another soul trapped in the house, another voice lost to the darkness. But then the door behind me opened. The light from the other side spilled into the room, and I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop to breathe. The house was closing in on me, the shadows reaching out like claws, but I kept running. I broke through the front door and into the yard, but the house didn't let me go so easily. The whispers followed me, echoing in my mind, growing louder, more frantic. As I reached the street, I looked back once more, and that was when I saw it. The figure in the window, the skull-faced man, and this time he was smiling. I couldn't breathe, my chest tight with terror. The air around me seemed thick, like the very atmosphere was trying to crush me. I didn't know where to go, but all I knew was that I had to get away from that house, from whatever had taken root in that forsaken place. I ran, my feet pounded against the cold pavement, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I didn't dare look back at the house. The image of the figure in the window was burned into my mind, its twisted grin still haunting me. It was as if the thing had known I would come, knew I would be the one to open the door, the one to awaken whatever it was that had been buried there for so long. I turned down the street, my footsteps echoing, the world around me growing eerily quiet. No cars, no people, just the sound of my own ragged breaths and the pounding of my heart. But even in the silence, I felt it, that nagging sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me, following me. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting around, half expecting to see the figure from the house appear at any moment, but there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows stretching longer and longer as the night deepened. I reached the end of the block and stopped, gasping for breath, my body trembling. I leaned against a lamppost, trying to steady myself, but the cold sweat that dripped down my back told me I wasn't free. I could still feel the presence, the oppressive weight of whatever had haunted that house. I pulled my phone from my pocket, desperate for some connection to the outside world. But when I looked at the screen, I froze. No signal. The screen was blank, showing only the endless spinning circle. I tried again, pressing the buttons, but it was useless. The phone was dead. Or maybe it had never worked in the first place. My eyes flickered back to the house, still visible in the distance, looming like a dark silhouette against the night sky. But it was more than just a house now. It was alive, a living, breathing entity that had already taken hold of me. A scream bubbled in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't afford to let it consume me. Not now. I had to keep going. I turned away from the house, forcing my legs to move, each step heavier than the last. I couldn't stay out here forever. I needed somewhere safe, somewhere far from the house. I needed to forget about what had happened there. I needed to escape. But as I walked, the strange, oppressive silence followed me. The air felt thick, as though it were closing in on me, and every step I took seemed to pull me further into the shadows. I glanced over my shoulder again, but there was nothing. Only the street lights casting long, distorted shadows across the sidewalk. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away from that place. The streets felt endless, and the world around me seemed to blur into one long, dark tunnel. I could hear the faint whispering again, soft at first, like a distant murmur in the back of my mind. But then it grew louder. I froze, my blood running cold. "Come back," the voice whispered. "You can't leave. You belong to us now." I spun around, but the street was empty, the only sound my own ragged breathing. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be, but it was. I could feel them, feel the eyes on me, invisible but undeniable. The air around me felt colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more frantic, until they were no longer whispers. They were screams. I ran again, not stopping, not looking back. But it was pointless. The streets had become a maze, twisting and turning, leading me nowhere. Suddenly, I found myself in front of the same house. The house. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart sinking. How could this be? How had I ended up back here? The road I had just walked down hadn't led to this house. It was impossible. But there it was, looming, watching. The door was open. A cold wind blew from the house, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from inside. Heavy, deliberate steps. They weren't mine. I turned and ran again, my legs burning with the effort, my breath ragged. But the street stretched on, and the house was always there, always just behind me. It was as if the very world had become a reflection of that house, closing in on me from every direction. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like hours, days, maybe, since I had left the house. The house that had never really let me go. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the cold concrete, gasping for breath. My body was too tired, too broken, to keep running. I couldn't escape. Not from the house. Not from whatever had followed me. I looked around, but there was nothing but darkness, an endless void stretching out in every direction. The streets, the houses, the trees, they had all faded away, leaving nothing but the feeling of cold emptiness. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The figure. It was standing at the end of the street, its twisted silhouette bathed in the faint glow of the street light. And it was smiling. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was too late. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed, my body as stiff as stone. My heart thudded violently in my chest. But no matter how much I tried to make my legs move, they refused. Every nerve in my body screamed for escape, but it felt like I was glued to the spot, frozen by a force stronger than any fear I'd ever felt before. My eyes locked onto the figure in front of me, and I couldn't look away. It was as if something invisible was holding my gaze, forcing me to witness whatever this thing was about to do. The coldness in the air was unbearable, settling deep in my bones, making me feel as though I was standing on the edge of some dark, freezing void. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare. The figure's smile grew wider, and I thought for a split second that my vision was playing tricks on me. But no, it stretched unnaturally, almost impossibly wide, as if its mouth was capable of expanding beyond human limits, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth, each one too sharp, too long. It was grinning at me, but not in the way a person might grin. There was no warmth, no humanity in it. It was something predatory, something not quite alive. Its eyes, those hollow, black pits, glowed faintly, their inner darkness pulling me closer. I felt like I was falling into them, drowning in their emptiness. It knew everything about me, every fear, every secret. It knew the depths of my guilt, the sorrow I carried since moving here. It knew I had opened a door that should never have been opened. It stepped forward, and the air seemed to warp with every motion it made. The ground trembled slightly beneath my feet, not an earthquake, but a subtle shift, as if the very earth was beginning to crack, drawn toward this thing. The shadows seemed to stretch toward it, as if even the darkness wanted to be closer. "Do you really think you can leave?" it hissed, its voice sharp, like nails scraping on a chalkboard. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through the walls, making my head throb. My thoughts became disjointed, but I couldn't stop hearing those words. "Do you really think you can leave?" I wanted to scream, but my mouth was dry, my voice a mere whisper in the wind. My heart raced, pounding so loudly in my ears that I thought it might burst from my chest. It took another step toward me, and with each step, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so drastically that I could see my breath fogging in front of me. It was as if winter itself had decided to invade this moment, and I was left to stand in its frozen grasp. I felt a chill that wasn't just physical but something far deeper. It was as if this thing was reaching inside me, crawling through my skin, gripping my insides with its invisible hands. I was suffocating, trapped between the oppressive cold and the weight of this presence that seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. "Leave? Run? There is no escape," the figure continued, its voice now a whisper, yet it felt as though it was coming from everywhere at once. My legs still wouldn't move. My body was paralyzed. "You will never escape what you've unleashed." The house. I had opened the door. The very thing I had tried to avoid. The house's curse. The reason I had been running. It wasn't over. I hadn't escaped it. I had never escaped it. The figure's smile faded, and its face twisted, becoming something more grotesque. It was still human in shape, but it was something else now, an amalgamation of nightmares, of shadow and bone, a thing of unnatural proportions. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to do anything to get away from this nightmare. But the figure reached out, its long, bony fingers trembling as they hovered inches from my face. I could feel the cold emanating from it, so cold that it burned, a searing cold that threatened to freeze me from the inside out. And then, in one swift motion, it pointed downward, toward the ground at my feet. A wave of fear surged through me, the very air shifting, as if reality itself were folding in on itself. The ground trembled, deep vibrations coursing beneath my feet. It felt as though the earth was groaning, like some deep, ancient force was awakening. The sound came first, low and ominous, like a rumble from the depths of the earth itself crying out in pain. My chest tightened as I took a step back, but the figure remained where it was, its eyes still locked on mine. The ground beneath me cracked, thin fractures spreading like spider webs, breaking the earth into jagged lines. I stumbled back, panic flooding my body, but I couldn't stop looking down. Through the cracks in the earth, something was rising. I could see it now, emerging from the depths of the ground, dark, twisted shapes rising up, impossibly large. The smell of damp earth filled the air, mingled with something rotten, like decay. The earth seemed to recoil as the figure of the house itself began to emerge from the cracks, as if the very ground were pulling it up. The house from which I had fled, now somehow drawn back into existence. The walls groaned as though they were alive, creaking in protest. The windows remained dark, hollow, lifeless, as though the house were a carcass waiting for someone, to enter it once again. My legs finally gave way beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground. I could hear my breath, shallow and frantic, but all I could focus on was the sight of the house, impossibly large, rising before me, its very presence suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on me. The figure's laugh pierced the silence, a sound so cold it cut through my bones. It was almost mocking. "It's not over," it said, its voice a soft, cruel whisper. "You can never escape." I tried to scream, to cry out, but the words were lost in the choking fog of dread that filled the air. My heart raced, my head spun. The whispers from earlier grew louder, more urgent. The voices, those lost souls that had been trapped here, were coming back, and I could feel them, surrounding me, tugging at my mind. "Come back," they urged, their voices haunting, desperate. "Come back to us." I stumbled to my feet, my body shaking. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how I strained against it, I felt myself being pulled toward the house, toward the open door that now seemed to beckon me like the mouth of some great, monstrous thing. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. The figure stepped forward again, its smile now so wide that it looked like it might split its face in half. It raised a long, clawed finger, pointing at me as it whispered those final words. "You belong to it now." In that instant, the ground beneath me gave way. The earth cracked open, and I fell, falling into the darkness, into the cold embrace of whatever was waiting below. And as I plummeted, I heard it one last time, that chilling whisper, the thing that had haunted me all along. "You can never leave." I fell. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment, everything went silent. My heart, which had been pounding in my chest, was now a distant echo, fading as I plummeted further into the abyss. There was no ground beneath me, no sense of time, only the sensation of free falling into something far more terrifying than I could understand. The weightlessness felt strange, but it was the eerie quiet that gripped me the hardest. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, I slammed into something solid. The force of the impact rattled my bones, and I gasped, coughing in the thick, oppressive air that seemed to smother me. My eyes snapped open, but it was too dark to see anything. There were no stars, no light, just the overwhelming blackness that had become my world. I tried to move, to push myself up, but the ground felt wrong. It was soft, like wet earth, but with an odd, unnatural texture. Something damp clung to my skin. It wasn't mud. It wasn't anything I could identify, but I felt it crawling beneath me, like the ground itself was alive. My breath hitched as a chill settled deep inside me. The temperature was unbearable, colder than anything I had ever felt. A deep cold that pierced straight through my skin, into my marrow. And then I heard it, the whispering again. The same voices, low and urgent, surrounding me, crawling up from the darkness. Don't listen to them. The words were faint, almost inaudible, but they were there, cutting through the suffocating silence. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady, my head spinning. There was a pressure in the air, a heaviness, like I was suffocating in a thick, invisible fog. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but they didn't sound like they were coming from any specific place. It was as if the voices were seeping into my mind, burrowing into my thoughts. I turned, desperate to find some way out, but it was no use. The darkness stretched on endlessly, an all-consuming void. And then, in the distance, I saw a faint flicker of light, a soft, sickly glow, far away, like a dying candle. It beckoned to me, drawing me toward it. The whispers rose again, louder now, almost frantic. Don't go toward it. Don't go closer. But it was too late. My legs moved of their own accord, stumbling forward as though some unseen force was guiding me, pulling me toward that flickering light. I had no control. Every step felt like I was being dragged through a heavy, viscous fog, my feet sinking into the ground with each move. I reached the light, and it revealed a scene that made my blood run cold. The place I had landed in wasn't just a void. It was a cavern, a vast, unnatural space, stretching on for what seemed like miles. The walls were covered in what looked like ancient carvings, twisted symbols that pulsed with an eerie energy. They seemed to shift and writhe, like the symbols were alive, changing before my very eyes. And then I saw it, the thing that had been calling to me, the thing I had been running from, the house. It was there, standing at the far end of the cavern, towering impossibly large. But this wasn't the house I had known, the familiar, creaky home I'd once moved into. No, this was something darker, something ancient. The windows glowed with that same faint, sickly light. But there was no warmth in them, only emptiness. The walls of the house were cracked, aged beyond belief, and twisted with strange, grotesque patterns that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. I could feel it, the weight of the place, the dark force that radiated from it, pulling at me, tugging at my very soul. I tried to back away, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. It was as if I were rooted to the spot, frozen in place, unable to move, unable to escape. The whispers surrounded me, now a cacophony, all speaking at once, their voices scratching at my mind, tearing at my sanity. You belong to it, forever. The ground trembled beneath me. I could hear something moving beneath the earth, an ancient rumble that came from deep below. The house seemed to be breathing, exhaling dark energy, its pulse matching the rhythm of the tremors in the earth. Suddenly, I felt a shift, a terrible, unnatural weight on my chest. It was as if something unseen was pressing down on me, crushing me. I gasped for air, but it was as if the very atmosphere was being drained from the cavern. Every breath I took felt suffocating. I looked around, frantic, my eyes darting back to the house. The door, which had once been closed, was now wide open. A shadow, darker than the night itself, moved at the threshold, watching me. It was waiting. The whispers grew louder, all at once. It's your turn now. You will never leave. You will never escape. The shadow in the doorway moved forward, and with it came a cold, unbearable presence. Something that felt ancient, ancient beyond reckoning, a force of nature, a curse that had lingered long before I had ever stepped foot in that house. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, unable to fight it, unable to move. And then, just as I thought I would be consumed, I felt a sudden, terrible jolt. The ground beneath me cracked open once again, and the light, the faint glow that had once beckoned to me, flickered one last time before going out completely. I fell, and this time, I knew there would be no waking up. There would be no escape, no way out. The darkness closed in, and the whispers swallowed me whole. The next morning, the house sat eerily still, the silence thick and suffocating. The door remained open, and the windows dark. But if anyone were to look closely, they might notice something strange. The floorboards in the living room, once worn and creaky, now seemed to have new cracks. Small, insignificant changes, but changes all the same. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear the faintest of whispers, calling from inside, calling for the next person to move in. Story 3. It was late afternoon when I finally arrived in town. The sun had already begun to dip beneath the horizon, casting an orange hue over the unfamiliar streets. The air was cooler than I expected for early spring, but I didn't mind. A change of scenery was exactly what I needed. I had just gone through a difficult divorce, and the city I'd called home for years no longer felt like a refuge. I needed a fresh start, a place to put the past behind me. I wasn't sure what drew me to this old house. It was one of those places you wouldn't think twice about when passing by. 2 stories, with a sagging porch and ivy creeping up the sides. The kind of house that had clearly seen better days but still had a certain charm. I could picture myself here, curling up with a good book, a cup of tea in hand. The rent was cheap, the landlord a kind enough woman who didn't ask too many questions. For now, that was enough. As I unpacked my car, a woman from next door came over. She was in her late 50s, with graying hair tied back in a loose bun. Her eyes were kind, but there was something weary about her, as though she'd seen too much. "You're moving in?" she asked, her gaze drifting over the house. I nodded. "Yeah, just got here. I'm starting fresh, you know?" She gave a small, almost sad smile. "Well, good luck. This house is a way of making people want to leave, though." I paused, caught off guard by her comment. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing," she said, waving a hand. "Just old gossip. You'll hear things. Footsteps when no one's there. Creaky floors that aren't from the house settling. People get scared and move out. You'll be fine, though. I'm sure you'll be different." She gave me a knowing look before turning to walk back toward her house. I stood there for a moment, her words lingering in my mind. What was she talking about? Old gossip? It felt like there was more to it, but I pushed the thought aside. I had a long night ahead of me, and I was determined to make the best of this new beginning. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched even when you're alone. I had unpacked my things, set up the basics, and now it was time to get some rest. The rooms were dimly lit by the soft glow of my lamp, and I felt a strange sense of comfort in the stillness. But as soon as I lay down on the bed, the silence seemed to deepen, pressing in around me. I pulled the covers up tight and tried to relax, telling myself that this was normal. Old houses creaked. It was just the settling of the wood, the building adjusting to its own age. A loud, sharp creak broke the stillness. I froze. It came from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart thudded in my chest. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I had read that older homes often made strange noises, but that sound, it wasn't the usual groan of a house adjusting to the weather. No, it was deliberate, like someone or something walking down the hall. I lay there for a few minutes, straining my ears. Another creak, followed by a faint scraping noise. I could almost imagine the floorboards groaning under the weight of invisible footsteps. I didn't move. I didn't want to move. Minutes passed, and the sound didn't come again. I breathed a sigh of relief, telling myself it was just the house settling like they always say. But still, I couldn't shake the unease. My eyes darted around the dark room, searching for any sign of movement. Eventually, sleep found me, though it was restless, filled with dreams that I couldn't quite remember but that left me with a lingering sense of dread. When I woke the next morning, the house seemed normal again. The sun had risen, and the light filtered in through the curtains. But as I went about my morning routine, I couldn't shake the memory of last night's noise. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just getting used to the house. But then, I remembered the woman next door. She had said something about the house, something that didn't quite sit right with me. I couldn't quite make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was missing something. Something important. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood that afternoon, hoping to clear my mind. The town was small, quiet, and quaint. The streets were lined with old trees, their leaves beginning to bud in the early spring air. Everything seemed peaceful, far removed from the chaos of my past life. Maybe this place was exactly what I needed. As I walked, I passed by the neighbor's house, the one who had warned me about the strange happenings in my new home. She was sitting on her porch, rocking slowly in her chair, a cup of tea in her hands. She waved at me as I approached. "Taking in the town?" she asked, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Yeah, just needed some air," I replied, offering a smile. "I was thinking about what you said the other day, about the house. Is there really something to it?" She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she was deciding how much to say. Finally, she sighed, setting her tea down on the porch table. "Look," she began, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. "The house you're in, well, it's had its share of strange tenants. Folks who've come and gone. Some of them didn't leave on their own terms." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "There was a man a few years ago. He moved in, just like you. Said he was starting fresh, just like you. But after a few weeks, he came running out of that house in the middle of the night, babbling about curses and things he couldn't explain. He left his stuff behind and never came back." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And before him, she continued, there was a woman, young, sweet. She'd been there for months. Then one day she just disappeared. No note, nothing. The neighbors say they heard things, voices, footsteps, like someone was always there when no one should have been." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What kind of things?" She shook her head. "I don't know exactly, but I've lived here long enough to know that sometimes the house, well, it doesn't let people go. Not easily." I didn't know how to respond. The story sounded insane, like something out of a bad horror movie. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more the strange noises I had heard the previous night came rushing back to me. "Do you think it's haunted?" I asked, the word slipping out before I could stop it. The woman didn't answer right away. She just stared at the house, her expression unreadable. "Haunted? Maybe. Or maybe something worse. The original owner of that house, Eliza Moore, she was obsessed with things most people would never understand. You don't need to worry about ghosts. You need to worry about what she might have left behind." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. My mind raced, but I didn't know what to say. I forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "Thanks for the warning," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed her. She nodded but didn't say another word, just turned her gaze back to the house across the street. As I walked away, her words echoed in my mind. You need to worry about what she might have left behind. Something about her warning felt too real to ignore, and a cold shiver ran through me as I realized I might not be alone in that house after all. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of the neighbor's warning gnawed at me, its implications growing darker by the minute. The house seemed even more oppressive now, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a whisper in the dark. Every gust of wind outside sounded like a distant whispering voice, too soft to make out but too clear to ignore. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was all just nerves, a side effect of moving into a new place. But as I lay in bed, the stillness around me grew unbearable. I found myself drawn to the attic, as if something were calling me there. I wasn't sure why I felt the urge to explore, but it was strong, almost instinctual. The stairs creaked as I climbed, the air in the attic thick and musty. Dust hung in the air like a thick fog, and the faint smell of something old and forgotten filled my nostrils. There was something about this attic, something more than just the usual clutter. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I moved through the space, careful not to disturb too much. At the far end of the room, hidden behind a stack of old crates, I noticed an old, leather-bound journal. Its edges were frayed, the cover cracked from years of neglect. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong with the other forgotten relics of the house. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up, a strange sense of unease flooding through me. What was this? And why had I never noticed it before? I opened the journal, and my eyes immediately fixed on the first entry. It was written in a neat, almost delicate hand, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. Asterisk, the door is almost ready. I can feel it now, the pull of something greater, something more powerful than I ever imagined. I followed the rituals to the letter, and tonight, the air feels thick with promise. The spirits are restless, waiting to be called. I have opened the path, and soon they will come. Soon, I will have everything I've ever wanted. Asterisk, I froze, the words blurring in front of my eyes as a cold chill swept through the attic. I tried to shake it off, but the words, those words, felt like they were reaching out to me, like they were meant for me to find. I turned the page, my hands trembling. The next few entries were more erratic, less coherent, filled with feverish scrawlings about rituals, sacrifices, and the power of the other side. The writer, Eliza Moore, seemed consumed by the idea of summoning something, though it was unclear exactly what. Asterisk, tonight, the moon will be right. The ritual is nearly complete. The door will open. I will speak to them. Asterisk, I set the journal down for a moment, the weight of what I was reading sinking in. This wasn't just some old diary. It was the twisted ramblings of someone who had crossed a line, who had done something unforgivable. And then, my eyes landed on a final entry, written hastily, almost in a panic. Asterisk, I have seen them. I have felt their presence. They are not what I expected. The door is open, but it is not me they want. It is the house. And now, it is too late to stop them. Asterisk, a loud crash downstairs broke my concentration, jolting me out of my thoughts. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, the attic felt suffocating, like it was closing in on me. The journal slipped from my hands and landed on the floor with a soft thud. My mind raced as I slowly made my way toward the stairs. Had I heard footsteps? No, it couldn't be. The house was old, settling, creaking. That's all it was. But as I stepped into the hallway, I realized I wasn't alone. The air had grown colder, the shadows longer. Something was in the house. Something was waiting. And suddenly, I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. I froze, standing in the dark hallway, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The house felt different now, heavier, somehow, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything, that would make sense of the eerie silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. A cold draft swept through the hallway, brushing against my skin like a whisper. It wasn't the usual chill of the old house. This was something else, unnatural, unsettling. I shivered, and despite every rational thought in my head telling me to turn back, I crept forward toward the source of the crash I had heard earlier. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside, casting long shadows on the furniture. I stepped carefully, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The air was thick, oppressive, and every step I took felt like it was carrying me deeper into something I didn't understand. I reached the door frame of the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. The room was empty. Nothing had been disturbed, except for the chair that had tipped over, its backrest pressed into the carpet. I let out a slow breath, my mind racing for a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the wind, or a stray animal somehow making its way inside. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't that simple. Then I heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like someone was moving across the floor. I froze again, my blood running cold. The noise was coming from the far side of the room, near the window. I couldn't see anything clearly, the shadows obscuring whatever might be there. But the dragging sound was unmistakable. My eyes darted toward the corner, where a shadow seemed to linger. It wasn't a trick of the light. The shadow moved, slowly, as if aware of my presence. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the shape in the corner took form. It was there, just out of sight, but so close that I could feel its weight, its coldness in the air. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath, the words shaking in my mouth. The dragging stopped. A chill ran down my spine, my skin prickling as the temperature in the room dropped even further. My heart thudded painfully against my chest, the silence so deafening that it almost felt suffocating. And then, just when I thought the room couldn't possibly get any colder, I felt it, a presence, standing behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat, but there was nothing there, only the stillness of the house, pressing in on me from all sides. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. It was all in my head, I told myself. The house was old, the air was thick with dust, and the noises, well, they had to be the house settling. But as I stood there, in the middle of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the feeling dissipated. The cold lifted, the oppressive weight in the air eased, and the room returned to normal. I was shaking. My hands were trembling so badly I had to brace myself against the wall to stay standing. It didn't make sense. None of it did. I glanced down at the overturned chair again, my mind trying to make sense of the impossible. But there were no answers, just a cold, empty room and the unsettling feeling that I wasn't the only one living here. I took a deep breath and forced myself to leave the room, retreating back to the safety of my bedroom. But even as I shut the door behind me, I couldn't shake the sensation that the house wasn't just settling anymore. It was alive, and it was waiting for something. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, my head spinning. Maybe the journal had been right. Maybe Eliza Moore had opened something that was still lingering, something that was waiting for the next person to stumble across it. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I realized just how little I understood about this house, about the dark history it was holding so tightly within its walls. But there was no turning back now, not when I had already seen or felt what was here. I didn't know if I could stay, but I didn't know where else to go, either. I had no choice but to face whatever it was, head on. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to me like a second skin. It was still there, in the back of my mind, like a whisper I couldn't quite make out, a sensation of being watched that wouldn't let go. The house was silent again, but the silence felt wrong. It was too quiet, like the walls were holding their breath, waiting for me to do something. I tried to go about my day, distracting myself with mundane tasks. I made coffee, cleaned up a little, and even rearranged some of the furniture in the living room. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on anything else, my mind kept drifting back to the journal, to Eliza Moore's words. The idea that something, some entity, was still lingering here in the house felt like a weight on my chest, heavy and suffocating. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what had happened here, what Eliza had done, and what I was now dealing with. So, I decided to dig deeper. I spent the rest of the day researching the house. I searched online for any information, any mention of the property or its previous owners. It didn't take long before I found something. A local news article from years ago popped up. An old headline about a woman who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. The article mentioned her name, Eliza Moore. I read through the article with trembling hands. Eliza Moore had been the last person to live in the house before I moved in. She had disappeared without a trace, and the authorities had never been able to find any evidence of foul play. There had been rumors about her strange behavior, about her obsession with the occult and the supernatural. The article didn't go into much detail, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. I clicked on a few more links, each one confirming more of what I had already suspected. Eliza had been known around town as someone with an interest in the occult, rituals, ancient practices, and dark arts. She had reportedly spent a lot of time in the attic, where she'd been seen scribbling in a notebook, muttering to herself. I closed the laptop, the weight of what I had uncovered settling heavily in my chest. Eliza hadn't just been obsessed with the supernatural. She had been trying to open a door to something beyond this world. And now, whatever she had brought into this house, it was still here. But what had she opened, and how much of it had come through? The house suddenly felt more suffocating, more oppressive than ever. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever Eliza had done, whatever she had summoned, was still lingering, waiting for something, or someone. I couldn't just wait for it to come for me. I needed to find more. There had to be more answers hidden here in the house. Maybe I could stop it before it was too late. The attic, the journal, that was where it all started. I had to go back. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the stairs again. My heart pounded in my chest as I ascended to the attic. The air felt colder this time, like it was alive with a strange, electric tension. The floor creaked beneath my feet, but I kept moving, drawn toward the same spot where I had found the journal the night before. I scanned the attic, my flashlight flickering as I moved it across the dusty floor. There had to be something else, something I had missed. And then I saw it. A strange symbol was scratched into the wooden floorboards near the far wall. At first, I thought it was just a stain or a mark from years of neglect. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a random blotch. The lines were deliberate, an intricate pattern, etched into the wood as if with something sharp. I knelt down to examine it, my fingers trembling as I traced the edges of the symbol. It looked almost like a circle, with strange runes and figures inside. I didn't recognize the language, but it felt wrong. There was something about it, something that made my skin crawl. I stood up abruptly, my mind racing. This was it. This was what Eliza had been working on, what she had summoned. This symbol was the key, the portal to whatever lay beyond. I turned and made my way to the old chest in the corner of the room. It was the only other thing in the attic that hadn't been touched in years, its surface covered in dust. I tried the latch. It was stuck. After a few more tries, I managed to pry it open. Inside was more than I expected. Another journal, a few old, tattered papers. But what caught my eye were the small, weathered trinkets, stones, bones, and a bundle of dried herbs tied together with string. A ritual kit, I realized, and a chilling sense of dread settled over me. I picked up the journal first. It was smaller than the one I'd found earlier, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. The handwriting was different, though. It was messier, frantic, and the further I read, the more I realized that this journal belonged to Eliza's predecessor, the person who had lived here before her. Their writings were even darker, filled with cryptic symbols and words in languages I didn't recognize. The last entry stood out, written in a scroll that was almost unreadable. Asterisk, the ritual must be completed. It must be tonight. The door is almost open. I can feel them, their eyes on me. The house is no longer mine. They are coming, and they will take it all. Asterisk. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was happening again. The door had been opened. Whatever Eliza had started, it wasn't over. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, and I had no idea how to stop it. I stood there for a long time, the heavy silence pressing down on me, before I realized that I wasn't alone. The air grew colder, the shadows in the attic darker, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed through the room. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing through the attic, each step heavy with purpose. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the air in the room thick with something unspoken, something ancient. My body was frozen, my mind racing, torn between running and staying to face whatever was creeping closer. The attic seemed to stretch out before me, growing darker with each passing moment. My flashlight flickered again, the weak beam casting eerie shadows on the walls. The symbol on the floor, the one I'd found earlier, seemed to writhe in the darkness, like it was alive in a way that I couldn't understand. It pulsed, faintly, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. I could feel the presence now, a weight in the room that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was real. Whatever Eliza had done, whatever ritual she had begun, it was coming to fruition. The door was opening, and it wasn't just some metaphor or curse. It was a doorway, a portal to something beyond this world, a place where the rules of the living no longer applied. I could hear the footsteps clearer now. They weren't in my head, weren't just the house settling. They were real, and they were getting closer. I had to act. I couldn't just stand here, paralyzed by fear. I turned to the chest again, my mind racing. The journal was still in my hands, and I flipped through the pages frantically, searching for something, anything that could help me understand what I was dealing with. But the more I read, the less sense it made. The pages were filled with rambling thoughts, symbols, and descriptions of rituals that made no sense, words that twisted and shifted as I read them. My eyes darted over one passage, and I almost missed it. The name of the being Eliza had called. Azeroth. I stopped, my hand trembling over the page. It was a name I'd never heard before, but it sounded like something ancient, something evil, and I knew, deep in my gut, that this was the thing Eliza had tried to summon. Azeroth wasn't just a spirit or a ghost, it was something darker, something much older, and it wasn't alone. I slammed the journal shut, feeling the weight of its knowledge pressed down on me. I couldn't let it in. I couldn't let it out. I turned, my eyes scanning the attic for anything that could stop this, anything that could close the door, stop whatever ritual Eliza had started. But the room was empty. The trinkets in the chest, the symbols on the floor, they were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't solve. I needed something more, something to fight back. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the attic, partially hidden behind an old wooden beam, was a small, ornate box. It looked out of place, too clean, too perfect for something that had been here so long. I walked over to it, my feet moving almost on their own accord. The box was delicate, its surface intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. I felt an odd pull toward it, an undeniable urge to open it. My hand hovered over the lid, but as I touched it, a cold shock jolted through my fingertips, and I pulled my hand away. I stared at the box for a long moment, trying to steady my breath. There was something about it, something that made my blood run cold. But I knew, deep down, that this was it. This was the key to stopping it all. I reached for the lid again, this time more cautiously. As I opened it, the air in the room shifted. It grew heavier, colder, and the shadows around me seemed to grow thicker, like they were alive. I could feel the presence of something else, something not quite human, watching me from the corner of the room. Inside the box, there was a small, ornate dagger. Its handle was carved from bone, the blade thin and gleaming in the dim light. But it wasn't the dagger that caught my attention. It was a note that lay underneath it, a piece of paper, yellowed with age, crumpled and torn at the edges. I unfolded it carefully, my fingers trembling. Asterisk, the blood must flow, the door must close. Sacrifice is a price of peace. The soul must be given to keep Azeroth at bay. Asterisk, my heart stopped. Sacrifice. The word echoed in my head, the weight of its meaning settling on my chest like a 1,000-pound stone. I looked at the dagger again, my mind racing. I couldn't sacrifice anything. I couldn't give in to whatever this was. But the message was clear. The only way to stop Azeroth, to stop whatever Eliza had opened, was to make a sacrifice, to offer something or someone to close the door. I backed away from the box, my mind whirling with panic. I couldn't do this. I couldn't. But even as I told myself that, I knew that there was no other choice. The presence in the room was growing stronger, and the footsteps were getting louder. I could feel them, drawing closer, closer. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, and I spun around, my heart in my throat. The shadows in the corner of the attic were moving now, creeping toward me like liquid darkness, taking form. Azeroth was coming. I had no choice. I grabbed the dagger. The cold steel sent a shock through my hand, and I raised it high, my mind numb with terror. But before I could make a decision, the house seemed to groan. The floor beneath my feet trembled, and the walls shook as though the very foundations of the house were cracking open. Then, the door at the far end of the attic slammed open with a deafening crash. The darkness flooded in, and I heard a voice, a whisper, sinking into my mind. Asterisk, it is time. Asterisk. I dropped the dagger, my body trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the one to offer the sacrifice. But it was already too late. The room around me began to warp, the air thickening as the shadows reached out to grab me. My heart pounded, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The footsteps, the whispers, they were all around me now, closing in, surrounding me. And then, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I felt it. Something cold and wet on my neck, something with claws breathing down my spine. Azeroth had come, but it wasn't over yet. The darkness enveloped me, thick and suffocating, wrapping around my body like a shroud. I could feel it, like a weight pressing against my chest, pushing the air out of my lungs. The cold that had crept into the room moments before now felt like icy fingers running down my spine, biting into my skin. My mind raced, trying to understand what was happening, but everything seemed to blur together. My thoughts, the room, even the light from my flashlight flickering like it was struggling to stay alive. But there was something else in the dark with me. I could feel it. Its presence was undeniable. It wasn't just the house creaking or the wind howling outside. This was something different, something that shouldn't be. I held my breath, straining to hear. The whispers had stopped, replaced by the faintest rustling sound. Like fabric brushing against skin, my heart pounded in my chest, and I slowly turned my head, scanning the room with frantic eyes. But the darkness was all-consuming, leaving nothing but the hollow echo of my own breath in the air. That's when I saw them, 2 tiny pinpricks of light, faint but unmistakable, glowing in the distance. I froze, my body stiff with terror, unable to move. The lights blinked, like eyes watching me from the abyss. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The more I focused on them, the more they seemed to grow, expanding into 2 huge, round eyes that filled the entire room. Eyes that stared into my soul, cold and unblinking. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. I couldn't take my eyes off them. I wanted to scream, to run, to get out of this house, but my body was paralyzed, my limbs refusing to obey me. The eyes weren't just staring at me. They were looking through me, into something deep inside, like they were peeling back my layers, digging through every thought, every fear, every secret I had ever hidden. The air grew colder still, and I could feel my teeth start to chatter. The eyes were getting closer, slowly, impossibly, without making a sound. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, unable to carry me. And then, without warning, the eyes blinked. Once, twice. The sound of their lids closing echoed in the room like a thunderclap. A chill ran through my veins, and I gasped, my chest tightening. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a presence. It was something real, something ancient, something that wanted me. I snapped my head to the side, searching for a way out, but all I saw was more darkness. The attic door. If I could just make it to the stairs, I could get to the main floor, get out of this place, get away from whatever was happening here. But before I could move, I heard the footsteps again. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the corner of the room where the eyes had been. A soft, heavy tread, like someone or something was walking on the old floorboards with a purpose. The steps grew louder, closer, until it felt like the floor beneath me was shaking with every movement. The air grew thick again, and a soft breeze brushed against my cheek. But this wasn't a breeze. It felt wrong, like something was breathing down my neck. Something not human, something that shouldn't be. My heart raced in my chest, and I forced my legs to move, stumbling toward the attic door. But as I reached out for the handle, I froze. My hand hovered over the door, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I could turn it. The steps were right behind me now. I could hear them, feel them in my bones, each thud like a drumbeat in my skull. And then, a voice, soft, hissing, a whisper of wind. Asterisk, you can't leave. Asterisk. I turned sharply, my breath hitching. The room was empty, but I could feel it again. Something was there. Something watching. The shadows shifted, stretching unnaturally, and the darkness thickened, swallowing the edges of the room. I could barely see the edges of my own hands, my arms shaking as I reached for the door again, determined to escape. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to face this. Something deep inside me knew it, even as my body screamed to run. I had to understand what this was, what Eliza had awakened, what I had stumbled into. The truth was here. I could feel it, just beneath the surface, and if I didn't face it now, it would follow me forever. I turned back to the room, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The eyes were gone, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were louder now, closer. The floorboards creaked, but there was something else mixed in with the sounds. A low growl, deep and guttural, like an animal, but twisted. The darkness seemed to pulse with it, thudding against my chest. I stepped back, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. Asterisk, you've come too far. Asterisk. The voice was closer this time, almost like it was inside my head. The words came slowly, like they were being dragged from the depths of the earth. And then the growling stopped. I strained to hear, my heart in my throat. Silence, complete and utter silence. And then the floor creaked behind me, too loud, too sudden. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, shrouded in darkness, stood in the far corner of the room. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, unblinking. The figure took a step forward, then another, and another. I backed away, my chest tightening, the weight of the room pressing down on me. My mind screamed at me to run, to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen. And then the figure whispered, Asterisk, Azeroth is coming. Asterisk. I closed my eyes, my hands clutching at my head. No, no, this couldn't be real. But when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. The footsteps, the growls, the whispering, they were all gone. And I was alone. But the chill remained, crawling up my spine. The darkness lingered. I couldn't escape it. Not yet. I don't know how long I stood there, my feet glued to the cold floorboards, staring at the empty corner where the figure had been. The silence was overwhelming, crushing. The darkness around me pressed tighter, a palpable weight that seemed to close in on my every breath. But something had changed. I couldn't just stand there anymore. I had to know. I had to find out what was happening in this house, what Eliza had awoken, and why it was happening to me. I forced myself to move, inching toward the attic stairs. Each step felt like a battle, my legs heavy, my body shaking uncontrollably, but my mind screamed at me to keep going, to push through the fear. The journal, the one Eliza had mentioned, it was the key. If I could find it, maybe I could understand what I was dealing with. I reached the door and yanked it open, stepping into the narrow attic. The dim light from my flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, twitching shadows across the boxes and dusty furniture. The air smelled old, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. My heart pounded as I moved deeper into the attic. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, a constant reminder that this house was older than I could comprehend. The walls were lined with forgotten relics, mementos of a life that had long since moved on. But none of them mattered. I wasn't looking for memories. I was looking for answers. It didn't take long to find it. In the far corner of the attic, behind a stack of old furniture, I saw a weathered wooden chest. The lock on the front was rusted and broken, as if it hadn't been touched in years. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt before it, running my fingers over the rough surface, the grain of the wood worn smooth by time. There was something about the chest, something familiar, that made my heart race even faster. I opened it slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, resting atop a pile of tattered old clothes, was a leather-bound journal. I grabbed it, my hands trembling as I flipped it open. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The first few pages were filled with scribbles, thoughts written in a hurried, frantic hand. I skimmed through them, my mind trying to keep up with the words, but it was difficult. The entries were erratic, jumping from one topic to the next. Something about rituals, about summoning, about a pact made with something dark. I paused on a particular page, my breath catching in my throat. The words on this page were different, neater, more deliberate. It read, Asterisk, I have opened the door. I have invited Azeroth in. He will come for me, but he will take others too. The house is his now. It has been claimed, and I have no choice but to wait. The curse is set. There is no escape. Asterisk, Azeroth, that name again. It sent a cold wave of dread over me, settling in the pit of my stomach like a stone. I had heard it in the whispers, seen it in the eyes of the shadowy figure. Whoever, or whatever, Azeroth was, it was the key to all of this. The reason for the footsteps, the cold spots, the darkness that clung to every corner of this house. I read on, each word more chilling than the last. Asterisk, the ritual will bring him closer. I must finish it, or he will never leave. I am his servant now, and this house is his home. When I am done, I will be free. But the others will never escape. They will be bound to the house, just as I am. It is the only way. Asterisk. The journal's pages began to blur in front of me as I felt my pulse quicken. The weight of the words hit me all at once. Whoever had lived here before me had made a pact with something dark, something ancient, and now it was my turn to bear the consequences. I slammed the journal shut, my breath ragged in my chest. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before Azeroth came for me too. But where could I go? The house, it was already too late. The curse had been set, and I was trapped. I stood there, frozen, clutching the journal to my chest like a lifeline. The whispers started again, distant but unmistakable, swirling around me in the air. They were coming closer, growing louder with every passing second. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, right behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. because I knew what was waiting for me in the shadows. The growling started again. It was low at first, but quickly rising in pitch, filling the air with an unbearable pressure. I felt it in my bones, a vibration that rattled my teeth. The darkness around me seemed to pulse in time with the sound, like the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and almost playful. Asterisk, you thought you could leave. You thought you could escape. But the house has claimed you. Azeroth has claimed you. Asterisk, I dropped the journal, the pages scattering across the floor like leaves in a storm. My legs shook, and I stumbled backward, my hands reaching for the stairs. I didn't care about the journal anymore. I didn't care about the house's history or the curse. I only cared about getting out. But as I turned to run, I felt something cold brush against my shoulder. A hand, a cold, skeletal hand. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, but it was cut off as a hand tightened around me. The air went cold, the darkness thickening, closing in on me from all sides. Asterisk, Azeroth is waiting. Asterisk, I felt my feet leave the ground, the weight of the house's curse dragging me deeper into the darkness. And then everything went black. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. I couldn't move. The house was silent again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was waiting. The darkness pressed in around me like a suffocating blanket. My mind spun, grasping at straws as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My lungs burned, fighting for air, but I couldn't breathe. The coldness of the hand was still on my shoulder, a reminder of the thing that had grabbed me, and the weight of the house's curse bore down on me with terrifying finality. I gasped, my body jerking forward as if waking from a nightmare, but I wasn't awake. I was still in the attic, still in the house. The journal, Eliza's journal, was gone, and so was the feeling that I had even the smallest bit of control left. The fear that gripped my heart now was deeper, more visceral. This wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't just some twisted ghost story. This was something worse. Something that was always here. Something that had been waiting, just beyond the edges of the real world. I stood, trembling uncontrollably, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The light flickered and dimmed, threatening to go out. It was like the house itself was fighting me, trying to swallow me whole. I stumbled backward, feeling the floorboards creak beneath me. The air felt thick, impossibly thick, as if the house was somehow pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to shift, closing in. I wasn't alone anymore. I could hear them now, the whispers. They were louder, more insistent. They had followed me. They had been waiting in the dark corners, in the spaces between the house's walls. I tried to tune them out, but the more I tried, the louder they became. I could feel their presence surrounding me, like invisible hands reaching out from the shadows. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the attic, chilling me to the bone. My heart raced as the wind seemed to pick up speed, howling around me like a living thing. The room twisted and shifted, the furniture now appearing to move of its own accord. The walls groaned with the weight of something ancient, something alive. Then it happened. The floor beneath me cracked, a deep, echoing sound that sent a jolt of panic straight to my chest. I stumbled, trying to steady myself, but the crack widened, splitting the floor in half like the mouth of some monstrous beast. The house was alive. It was shifting, breathing, pulsating with a strange, malevolent energy that felt like it was clawing at my skin. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure, standing in the doorway, a shadow that stretched long across the room, its form barely visible against the inky blackness that clung to the walls. The shape was tall, impossibly tall, with a face that I couldn't quite make out. It was like the darkness had taken on a form, a shape that defied logic. And yet, there was no mistaking it. It was watching me. It was waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear rooted me to the spot, a weight I couldn't shake off. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, like a chorus of voices calling out to me from all directions. Asterisk, you should have left when you had the chance. Asterisk, a voice murmured, low and guttural. The figure took a step forward, its outline becoming clearer in the dim light of my flashlight. The darkness around it seemed to warp, bending in unnatural ways, as though it was feeding off the fear that radiated from me. My heart hammered in my chest, but my body felt frozen, trapped in the suffocating grip of the house. Asterisk, you're not going anywhere. Asterisk, the voice continued, its tone almost playful, as if it were enjoying my terror. I could feel the presence of Azeroth, the name that had haunted me from the very beginning. It wasn't just some ancient evil. It was something alive, something ancient and cruel, and it had claimed me. The figure stepped closer, and with it came a wave of cold so intense, I could feel it in my bones. I tried to move, to step back, but my feet wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed. I could only watch as it drew closer, its shape becoming clearer, until I could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. It was a face made of shadows, a void that seemed to consume the light around it. No eyes, no mouth, just an endless, deep blackness. It was like looking into the abyss itself, and I felt my sanity begin to fray at the edges. The more I stared, the more I felt myself being drawn into it, like a moth to a flame. And then, in a voice that was both everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. Asterisk, you were always meant to be here. Asterisk, I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my voice was gone. My throat was dry, my body shaking uncontrollably as the darkness crept closer, wrapping around me, suffocating me in its grip. The air felt thick, oppressive, like I couldn't get enough oxygen. The figure reached out, its long, skeletal hand stretching toward me. My heart skipped a beat, and I finally managed to move, stumbling backward, my feet tripping over the uneven floorboards. I crashed to the ground, my flashlight falling from my hand and rolling away. The light flickered before it went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The house was alive. It was feeding on my fear. Suddenly, I felt something cold and wet brush against my face. It was like a breath, but wrong, like something that had been trapped in the walls for centuries. I could feel its presence closing in around me, its breath hot on my skin. I could hear it now, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking toward me in the pitch black. The air grew colder still, and I felt my body begin to freeze from the inside out. The whispers returned, louder now, more desperate. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the presence was gone. The silence was deafening. I lay there, my body trembling, my mind racing. I didn't know how long I stayed there, minutes, hours, days. Time seemed irrelevant now. The house had claimed me. Azeroth had claimed me. But the worst part was that I knew, deep down, I wasn't alone. The house was never empty. It was always waiting. And as I stumbled to my feet, gasping for air, I heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper in the air. Asterisk, we're never leaving. Asterisk. I froze. I had to get out. I had to escape. But I knew it was too late. I didn't have time to think. There was no time to waste on second-guessing myself. No time to question what was real or not. The thing in the darkness, the entity that had haunted this house for who knows how long, was still out there. I had no idea what it wanted, but it was clear it had already marked me. I had become part of its twisted, ancient web. The air in the attic was thick, almost suffocating, and every breath I took seemed to draw in more of the house's oppressive energy. The floor beneath me creaked again, the sound far too loud in the thick silence. My heart raced, and I could feel the sweat on my skin, cold and sticky, as my mind raced for a way out. I stumbled toward the attic door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I expected resistance, a force pulling me back, but nothing came. I opened the door, and the creaking sound seemed to echo through the house like a warning, like the walls themselves were groaning in displeasure. I could hear the whispers again, soft at first, like a breeze, but then they grew louder, insistent, like hundreds of voices speaking all at once. They were calling to me, urging me to turn back, to stay, but I couldn't. I couldn't stay here any longer. I ran down the narrow hall, my footsteps thundering in the empty house. The walls seemed to press in on me, and every turn I took only led me deeper into its heart. My mind was reeling, and every step felt heavier, like the house was pulling me toward it, trying to keep me from escaping. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I descended, each step feeling like it might collapse under my weight. I didn't dare stop, not even for a moment. I couldn't. I had to get out. The front door, the only way out, was so close. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the house seemed to shift. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the door at the end of it further away than I remembered. My breath caught in my throat. It was happening again, just like the time before. The house was changing, warping, refusing to let me leave. The air in the house was so thick now it felt like a living thing, pressing against me, pushing me down. I could feel the coldness returning, that unnatural chill that sank deep into my bones, crawling under my skin. I started to feel the walls closing in on me, and panic surged through me, pushing me to run even faster. I reached for the door, my fingers numb as I grabbed the handle. It was cold, too cold. The handle wouldn't turn. I yanked it again, my pulse pounding in my ears. But the door remained locked, trapped in some kind of eternal loop. It was no use. I was trapped. Please, I whispered to myself, my voice breaking. Please, let me out. I backed away from the door, my mind swirling with thoughts of escape, of the future, of the life I could never have again if I stayed here. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was far worse. It was too still, too quiet. And then I heard it. A single, heavy footstep echoed through the hallway, followed by another. Slow, deliberate. I froze. My heart stopped beating in my chest. I knew what it was. The figure, the one from the attic. It had followed me. It was getting closer. My breath quickened as I glanced around the hallway, searching for any escape, any way to get out of this nightmare. The walls felt like they were pressing closer, like the house itself was alive, devouring the air around me. The temperature dropped even further, a biting cold that scraped at my skin, and I could feel my legs trembling. The footsteps came closer still, each step a drumbeat in the silence. I could feel the presence behind me, just out of sight, but I knew it was there. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I hadn't turned around to look. I couldn't stay here. I had to do something. I turned to the side and saw a window, just above the staircase leading to the front door. It was high up, but it was my only chance. The house would never let me out the front door. But maybe, just maybe, I could climb out of this window. I sprinted toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the sill, pulling myself up, the cold air rushing in as I pressed my palms against the glass. I could hear the footsteps growing louder, but I didn't look back. I didn't dare. With one final push, I shoved the window open, the creaking sound almost deafening. The cold air outside hit me like a wool, sharp and biting. I didn't hesitate. I pulled myself through the window, my hands scraping against the rough wood as I scrambled to the ledge. The ground below seemed so far away, but I didn't care. I had to escape. I climbed down, my hands shaking, my legs wobbling with exhaustion. The whispers from inside the house still echoed in my mind, urging me to turn back, to come home. I didn't listen. I hit the ground with a thud, landing hard on the grass below. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't dare look back at the house. But as I lay there in the cold night air, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The house was still watching. I could hear it. The footsteps. They were outside now, echoing in the distance, following me. My breath hitched in my chest. I thought I was free. I thought I had escaped. But whatever was in that house, whatever had claimed me, it wasn't done with me yet. And as I ran, as I fled into the night, I heard that voice again, whispering just behind me. Asterisk, you'll never leave. Asterisk. I didn't stop running. I couldn't sleep. Not after everything. I couldn't even close my eyes without feeling that cold, unnerving presence. Like the air itself was thick with eyes that watched, that waited. Every corner I turned felt like I was being followed. Every shadow longer than it should be. My mind played tricks on me. The sound of footsteps still echoing in my ears. The voice, the whispers, it was all too much. I wasn't safe, and no matter how far I ran, I knew it wasn't over. The next few days passed in a blur of panic. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind, frayed by the horror of the house, playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had followed me out of that place. I could feel it, could hear it. It wasn't just in my head. I moved to a small motel on the outskirts of town, hoping to find some semblance of peace, some escape from the suffocating grip of the house. But as I lay on the uncomfortable bed, staring at the ceiling, I could still hear it. The faint creak of the floorboards, the whispers. It was like the house had become a part of me, and no matter where I went, it would always be there, just beneath the surface, waiting to rise up again. I tried to call the authorities, but how could I explain what had happened? How could I describe the feeling of being hunted by something that wasn't human, by a force I couldn't begin to understand? They'd think I was crazy. I couldn't risk that. Instead, I tried to put it out of my mind, to pretend like nothing had happened. But it was impossible. Every night, the whispers grew louder. They'd invade my thoughts, wrapping themselves around my brain like tendrils of ice. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, still haunted me. The feeling of being watched never went away. And then, one night, the voice came again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was louder, clearer, as if the thing was standing right behind me. "You can't escape," it said. Its voice low and guttural, like something old and ancient. "You belong to us now." I jerked up from the bed, my heart racing. My eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The only sound was my own breath, heavy in the silence. I forced myself to calm down, to convince myself it was just the stress, the trauma of everything I'd gone through. But even as I tried to reason with myself, the doubt crept in. What if it wasn't just my mind? What if I hadn't escaped after all? I had to know. I packed what little I had left and headed back to the town, to the house. Even as I drove, I could feel the pull, the weight of the place calling to me. The house wasn't done with me. It never would be. I arrived just before dusk, the sky hanging low and heavy with clouds, casting the town in a pale, sickly light. I drove past the house, my heart pounding in my chest as I glanced at it. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes, and the front door stood wide open. I couldn't let fear stop me. I knew that if I didn't face it now, I'd never be free. The house had already claimed me once. I wasn't going to let it happen again. I parked in front of the house, my hands trembling as I reached for the door handle. The air felt colder here, even though the sun was setting. The familiar weight of dread settled over me, but I couldn't stop now. I stepped out of the car, and with every step toward the house, the air seemed to grow heavier, the silence more oppressive. I walked up to the front door, my mind racing. The door swung open before I could touch the handle, as if it had been expecting me. The familiar creak of the floorboards echoed from within, and I shivered. The house was waiting. I stepped inside, the smell of dust and decay filling my nostrils. The air was thick with something else, something I couldn't place, an unshakable sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. The house felt alive, watching, breathing. I moved through the darkened hall, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I needed to understand, needed to find a way to break the curse, if that's what it was. I couldn't keep living like this, with the fear always at the edge of my mind, the whispers never far behind. I made my way to the attic. The stairs creaked underfoot, groaning with every step, as if warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had come this far, and I had to know the truth. The truth about the house. The truth about the rituals. The truth about the thing that was still here, waiting for me. When I reached the attic, I was met with the same sight I had seen the night I left. The journal, the symbols, the strange drawings. I approached the old wooden desk, the air thick with dust, and my hand trembled as I reached for the journal. It was open to a page I hadn't seen before. The ink was smeared, as if someone had hurriedly written something, their hands shaking in fear. Asterisk, we cannot leave. Asterisk, the words read. Asterisk, we belong to the house now. The door is open. The door is always open. They are always watching. They will never stop. Asterisk. My stomach dropped as I read those words. It was too late. Whatever was in this house, whatever force had been awakened, was still here. It hadn't let me go. I didn't know what to do. I had no answers, only more questions. And as I stood there, the weight of the house pressing down on me, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I would never be free.